All right, welcome to another edition of Friends and Enemies. I'm Jeff Nquist, and I'm in the United States. And with me is Alex Benesch. He's in Germany, and we discuss current affairs and strategy, intelligence, espionage, and we're going to talk about China and how close is China with Russia? How close has it been with Russia in the past? Alex, you've got some notes, and I would just make one commentary. I had the book here. Yeah, my friend um, Nevin Gusak wrote this book, Golitsyn Vindicated, and of course, Golitsyn had made the claim that when he was working in a KGB think tank in 1959, he heard the chairman of the KGB, Alexander Shelepin, say that they were planning a fake split with another communist country so that the West would come in and support that country. And when asked what that country would be, he said China. And that was the year before the Sino-Soviet split began, which I think was in December of 1960, the following year, when the 20th Party Congress, when all the communist parties of the world met in Moscow. And Deng Xiaoping was the head of the Chinese delegation, and supposedly there was this friction that unraveled. And of course, there was initially in the United States skepticism about the Sino-Soviet split. There was a debate. But ultimately, when it trickled into the economic and political sphere, the politicians and the money people wanted to believe the Sino-Soviet split because, of course, they wanted to exploit Chinese labor. They wanted to invest in China because it would offer a bigger return, right? You have a very poor country, so anything you invest in it is going to give you a bigger return. But of course, you had to have Kissinger go to China and Nixon then go to China. You had to have then Carter begin the trade relationship. You had Mao die. You had Deng Xiaoping come in and say it's glorious to be rich, while Deng Xiaoping is telling the party people, look, we just need to do our own NEP. We just need to have the capitalists teach us how to trade. The same way Lenin said in the 1920s to his party comrades in the Soviet Union or in the Russian Federated Socialist Republic, we need to learn how to do this. And of course, you have this whole repeat. Only China did its NEP on steroids. It went for decades now. And of course, they're pulling back the reins. They've got a giant navy. They're building nuclear weapons like sausages, and they are on the warpath, so to speak. And Russia is at war ahead of them, and they are coordinating. And so the question is, how much has this been a strategy, a plan all along that we missed, that Kissinger basically fed us this line of crap that Nixon bought, that we have been sucked into this, and strategically now we're basically facing the one clenched fist. And what does that mean? So Alex, let's hear your notes on this.
Well, to me, it always seemed crazy that people would doubt, the way Golitsyn explained these things, because to me it always seemed so obvious. Because first of all, Stalin was the ultimate control freak. He wanted to run everything, and of course, he and his people, they had a 30-year head start, compared to the Chinese Revolution. So, since the October Revolution, the Russians had been in the game. They won the civil war in Russia. They reestablished the economy. They put so many people into camps. They killed so many other people. They had all this crazy counterintelligence going on. If you, as a Russian, had if you had European relatives, you were a suspect. If you were mailing, with people in Europe, and you were a suspect. So all this time, 30 years of running this communist empire, and then you get the new China. So obviously, you would think the Russians played a decisive role. And so, if you look at the early Chinese revolutionaries, these were people from various backgrounds. Some of them, not so poor. Some of them came from fairly normal families, but they spent time.
Mao was from a prosperous peasant.
Yeah.
His father was a prosperous farmer, basically. Zhou Enlai went to school in Paris,
Yeah, and
right?
yeah, quite
So
a bunch
these
of them.
people, I mean, a Chinese guy that has the money to go to school in Europe and to learn foreign languages and to have that kind of education, that is not from a poor background. So
Exactly.
the interesting thing is the proletariat, the leaders of it, they were really very much in the school of Lenin, who said you have to have this
Yeah,
intellectual vanguard
yeah, but
of dedicated professional revolutionaries, and
but
that's who they
they
were.
but these guys, they still didn't have, they didn't have the budget to just to build all this great movement of their own. Some of them, when they actually went to Europe, these Chinese communists, they spent time in Berlin. They spent some time in Paris. They had to work on the side. Sometimes they had to work in factories to bring in money for their efforts. They got help from communist networks over here. So, for example, in
Mm-hmm.
France, lots of communists in France, and also lots of communists in Germany. So that's when they also got help. But of course, these were established communist networks that were tied to Russia. So, so at some point, these Chinese guys, they went back home, and then things really took off. But at that point, the Soviet Union, or Soviet Russia, Russia had existed for 30 years as a communist empire, and so
And by the way, we might go into a little bit about the relationship between Stalin's Soviet Union and China, because when the Republic of China first formed, it was the Republic of China, the old empire was gone. Sun Yat-sen had created this. He had support from Britain and America. But then when he died and Chiang Kai-shek came in control of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, Stalin made an unusual decision in the 1920s, and that was that the Soviet Union would support not the communists in China because they were considered to be not effective, too small of a group. He supported the Kuomintang. He supported Chinese nationalism. And so initially in the earlier part of the 20s, when the Soviet Union, the Kuomintang had Soviet military advisors. They were supported by the Soviet Union. And in fact, Chiang Kai-shek's son went to the Soviet Union to be educated there. And then a funny thing happened around 1926. Chiang Kai-shek went on a tour of the Soviet Union, and he actually saw it.
interesting.
And that completely, he pretended that, the Chinese are very polite, but on the inside, he was going,
Oh
uh-oh,
God.
these people are bad. They're manipulating me. This is a Potemkin village. This isn't what I want for China. And so even though, and this is how tough he was, even though his son was almost like a hostage there, and his son ended up becoming a hostage, he went back to China and he expelled all the communists out of the Kuomintang.
Holy moly.
And that includes get rid of these Soviet military advisors. I don't want it. And he brought in Germans to be
Hmm.
his military advisors. You probably know this.
I got some notes here from the book. The Master of Shadows, Kang Sheng and the Chinese Secret Service. Now, Kang Sheng, of course, is a legend over there. But the whole training came from the Russians, essentially. So when we talk Chinese intelligence, it's essentially Russian intelligence. So,
Yeah, they were
this was,
trained in Russian methods,
yeah,
and especially when the People's Republic was formed in 1949 and Mao won the Civil War. Their military training, their military systems, their
everything.
organization, their espionage service. I mean, Konstantin Preobrazhensky, who was a KGB officer I've interviewed, I've written articles about him. What he told me was they have the exact same training we do. And he said basically the counterintelligence system that the Russians and Chinese have is identical. And he said, our system's impenetrable.
Yeah.
That's what he told me. He said, so the Chinese system, which he says is bigger and maybe not as efficient in certain respects as the Russian, he said they're really not penetrable. You can't, and they know this. They know that the Western services are penetrated, and they know that if they they work for the other side's intelligence service for real, they're going to get caught and die.
Oops.
Yeah.
So, well, in the 1920s, China was a very chaotic place. So, of course, the old dynasties were were not in control as they once were. There's a whole nother backstory to this, with the different dynasties and the super large wars. I mean, they had wars that were so big and had so many victims. This was way larger than anything we saw, let's say, in Europe. We only saw these kind of numbers in the 20th century, so that's how crazy that was. And so in the 1920s, various European powers had different sized spheres of influence, the so-called concessions, on the territory of China, with their own administration, their own police force, and their own secret services. And then you had the mafia groups, and then came, slowly but steadily, then came the communist groups, but they were really small at first. And so this Kang Sheng, for example, this guy, Kang Sheng, who became this big intelligence man, Kang Sheng came from the landed gentry, came into contact with socialist literature in the early 1920s through his professor, which had been translated into Chinese, of all things. Now, of course, if you read Karl Marx in the original German language, it's complete garbage. But if you translate it into China, that's a whole nother level of crazy. But, he apparently liked it. So you already had these networks.
Just to say this, the dialectics, Mao wrote a book on dialectics, which I have, and it's interesting. It's very confusing for a common sense person. But China had this, because of Taoism, and this, you have the flexible and the hard. You have the mountain and the valley. You have the dark and the light. They had this dualistic philosophy about the feminine and the masculine. All of these symbols, the yin and the yang, this was assimilable into Marxist dialectics. So the Chinese were able to relate to it because of the Taoist strain of thought in Chinese thought. I just thought I'd mention this. And so you run into this in Mao's writings.
Interesting. Well, so you had these networks that were growing. So this professor, he screens his students and he gives this literature to these students. And then he's scouting these new talents like Mr. Kang Sheng. And so then in the next stage was this. The Russian Sergei Dalin arrived at the first joint congress of the Chinese Socialist Youth Corps with a forged passport, and he was identified by French counterintelligence in China as an agent of the Russian Secret Service GPU, a forerunner of the KGB. They changed names a bunch of times, and so the GPU helped set up special commandos with the Chinese communists. So they were teaching them various skills.
And what year was that?
This was in the 20s, early 20s,
Yeah.
Very early 20s.
Okay. So this is the kind of thing that
this is a few years after the revolution in Russia. So they're already starting to get stuff done in China. But China at the time was very chaotic. European powers had their own thing going on in China, but the Russians were trying. So two specific people were also present on behalf of Moscow when the Chinese Communist Party was founded in a very small circle. And then
that
almost
was in Shanghai, right?
I think that was that.
As I recall.
Almost all of the participants were arrested by the French. And escape was some people escaped because someone knocked on the door and announced something like a warning. So this was a difficult environment to get communism, off the ground in China, but they were certainly trying. And so after returning home, Wang Jinmei and Deng and Ming reported to Kang Sheng about the founding Congress. So this was the birth of the Communist Party of China. In 1922, Deng and Wang went to Moscow to attend an important event attended not only by Chinese communists, but also by members of the nationalist Kuomintang. So they had to share.
Because Stalin was romancing the Kuomintang, and of course the Chinese communists were actually allowed to join the Kuomintang. So they were in the Nationalist Party. Mao was in the Kuomintang at one time, and until they were expelled.
And so, because China was so dangerous at first for the communists, they actually sent a bunch of people to Europe because they felt more safe in Europe. So these Chinese people, they come to Germany, they come to Paris, they come to France, and they live in Paris. And they connect with communist circles that were already established, and they were more protected. So this was a safe training ground to train these Chinese communists in a more safe environment. So this was also the same with Lenin and Trotsky. They spent time in Europe, of course, and. According to witness statements, Kang Sheng completed an internship at a technical university in Berlin in 1922. His father is said to have provided the appropriate or the necessary contacts for this. And by the way, Shandong was once a German colony, so the Germans also tried to set up something over there.
Yeah, they lost that in World War I believe. That's when they lost. I think they were pushed out of there during the war.
Zhu and Lai commuted back and forth between Berlin and Paris at the time.
Yeah, Zhou Enlai went to school in Paris, and where I believe he met the Ho Chi Minh, who also went to school in Paris.
There was a communist Chinatown community in Paris in the Rue Godefroy and the associated neighborhood. So this is where the Chinese guys were parked. Trained, and there was a woman who was trained by Soviet Russian intelligence. Her name was Suzanne Giraud. She was from the French Communist Party, and she handed out the money, and so they used that for the printing of a communist newspaper by Deng Xiaoping, who much later became the leader of China.
Yeah, after Mao. Yeah, Deng became the leader for quite a while after Mao.
So this is how this went. They moved these guys to Europe, trained them, funded them, screened them if they were reliable, gave them some test operations to see if they can handle this. Learning tradecraft, all the usual stuff, the dead drops, the meetings, the getting tailed, shaking off a tail, all that stuff. So this was done in Europe where it was safer. Kang was in Paris and is said to have set up secret structures there. And he was monitored by the experienced French communists on behalf of Moscow. In 1924, the revolutionaries went home to China after their basic training and continued to be trained there in tradecraft and communist ideology through the works of Nikolai Bukharin, who worked on the Soviet daily newspaper Izvestia until 1937, did not survive the Stalinist purges.
And, he got put in jail by Stalin and killed.
It happened a lot
because he was a believer in capitalism. So when the NEP came along, he was a big champion of the Russians' inner circle for capitalism for NEP. But then when Stalin got rid of NEP in 1929, he couldn't believe it. He thought, you're going to destroy us. We need to have this economic liberalism to make the system work. And Stalin said, you're not a real Marxist. Cut it out. And he basically tried to agitate within the Communist Party, Soviet Union, and he ended up in jail and being executed.
Yeah, that's how that went. So Moscow's Sun Yat-sen University was one of several training camps for the Chinese communists, as well as for the Kuomintang nationalists. The first director of that school was Karl Radek, who had become a member of the Central Committee of the CPSU, but was thrown out of the party in 1927 and exiled to Siberia. That's on a side note here. And
And I think he was eventually executed too.
yeah, I think he was one or two guest teachers at the university. So one of the teachers there was Leon Trotsky, who went into exile in 1929, was murdered by Soviet agents in 1940, I think in Mexico.
In
Yeah,
Mexico. Yeah,
that was the
his
ice pick,
daughter's
right?
boyfriend was
That
the
was
assassin.
the ice pick, right?
Yeah, it was kind of like an ice pick. He attacked him, and then he just was immediately remorseful, and he spent a long time in a Mexican jail. Got out when Khrushchev was, I forget what year, 1959, 60, whenever he got out, and they gave him the Order of Lenin
Oops, that's
under Khrushchev. Even though Khrushchev had denounced Stalin already, they gave Lenin's murderer the Order of Lenin.
for services
So,
rendered. There was also the Communist University of the Working People of the East, which was supposed to educate or train Asian cadres. On behalf of Lenin, Mikhail Borodin established a military academy on a small island near Canton in order to have new officers trained by Soviet military advisors for the Chinese communists and nationalists at the time.
yes,
Uh,
that's when they were working for the nationalists until they got kicked out.
yeah. Borodin
Yeah.
also fell from grace, eventually died in a labor camp. Kang Sheng was tasked with special affairs for political security. We all know what that means. And Chinese were frequenting the Soviet consulate in Shanghai, where GRU agents such as Kusov and Koyenikov were based. These two Russians were in charge of the Chinese Communist Party's combat departments, because
hmm
that's what they needed. So,
I
uh,
mean, they were basically infiltrating while the Soviets were pretending to be the friends of the Kuomintang. With these communists, they were basically infiltrating the Nationalist Party in China. And their eventual plan was, of course, to take over the regime. And so they were going to do an internal subversion thing. That was Stalin's idea by basically romancing and deceiving Chiang Kai-shek. But his eyes opened at one point and he turned against him. But that's one of
yeah.
their ways of operating.
So then, Moscow sent Sergei Dalin, who had been observing the Congress of Communist Youth Corps years earlier, and GPU agent Sidorkin. The Kremlin ordered that the Chinese communists had to work with the nationalist Kuomintang for the time being. And the Russian agent Borodin sought out the most capable people and put Shunjiang in touch with the GPU, basically KGB, who then referred him to a training facility in Vladivostok, where he received thorough training in espionage and armed insurrection. He even became Zhu Enlai's deputy, but was arrested by the Kuomintang and betrayed some of his comrades, which is said to have led Enlai to kill Shunjiang's family members as revenge. So that's how they worked. Kang Sheng, who became really famous and successful, Kang Sheng is said to have gone through the GPU training, that's KGB training, and then built up the according intelligence structures for the Chinese Communist Party. He distributed a pamphlet to a select few men, which was essentially a copy of the GPU manual for the basic training of new cadres. And
Yeah, I should mention Zhou Enlai. I mean, the way that we pronounce his name is Zhou Enlai. He was sort of the premier. He was sort of the guy that did all the hard, heavy lifting for Mao, especially later in Mao's life. And he was a very sophisticated. He was an effective diplomat, and he was a very effective leader among the Chinese. You could call him a kind of Mandarin. He was very well educated, but he was Mao's pet. And very famously, Mao was quite abusive to him at times. In fact, denying him cancer treatment
oh
because
boy,
Mao wanted him to die before Mao died. He was even jealous of him, like, oh, he's going to live longer than me, huh? And of course, but Zhou Enlai, he just remained the faithful servant of Mao to the end. And they died around the same time. I forget. I think Forget whether Zhou Enlai survived him. I think he did, but not by much.
So then, some members of the Chinese Communist Party were soon disappointed by the party leadership, which, quote, was ready at any time to go to battle at the slightest sign from Moscow, regardless of the consequences. Interesting. So basically, Moscow is pulling the strings, and they're testing these new cadres. They're training them, and then they expect them to follow these orders. And then they watch and observe, through snitches, who is dissatisfied, who doesn't like Moscow, who has doubts, who is not 100% on board with the program. And so, so of course, Moscow made sure that these Chinese revolutionaries were not trusting each other too much. They had to be super loyal to Moscow, but they had to be wary of each other, and they had to snitch on each other in order to weed out, the undesirables. That's how that went. And anybody was replaceable. So this was made clear very early on. So you could be taken out and replaced by somebody else, a younger person. And so, of course, if you messed with the Kremlin, your wives and children would also be in danger. So this were strict mafia rules. They were not messing around. The Sixth Congress of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, was held outside Moscow in a GPU sanatorium that was thoroughly bugged with listening devices. These Chinese communists were supposed to set up their own secret services and did so in accordance with the Soviet training. The Soviets also largely determined the CCP's Politburo members. Stalin at the time especially relied on Li Lizan. Lizan considered himself to be the Lenin of China, and he basically Bolsheviked the party according to the Russian model.
And by the way, whether you're looking at the Spanish Civil War, how the GPU and at the time the NKVD regarded the Spanish communists, they were purging communists within the Spanish movement. They even killed people in France,
betrayed them to the fascists.
Yes, and murdered people. They wanted, and just like murdering Trotsky, anybody that didn't follow the Moscow line. Within the communist movement worldwide, one of the things was keeping the communist movement strictly under the thumb of Moscow. This was very much part of the way Stalin did everything, because it had to be a unified movement. And even to the point where in the United States, a lot of people don't know this, but there were two communist parties formed in the United States after the Bolshevik Revolution, one in New York and one in Chicago. And Lenin, this is the thing with John Reed, Lenin, who was at both of these conventions, Lenin said they have to be one party.
Yeah.
And the Russians who were in America were very big in their influence in forming these parties and making them loyal to Moscow and making them ultimately one party, which became what is known as the Communist Party USA, but it had another name when it was formed. It's gone through different iterations. And then the leader of the American Communist Party was handpicked by Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
And this is known by the writings of
and also
the guy that wrote,
these select people, these people that were chosen by Moscow, they had the codes for the encrypted communications. So secret communications these communications could only go through very specific people. You were not supposed to have your own side channels and back channels. So this was strictly handled by very select people. So you couldn't just send a message to Moscow or whatever. This was there was a system to it. And so it was pretty miserable at the time to be a Chinese communist, because not only was there this internal paranoia, but you were also hunted by the French, British, mafia gangs, the Kuomintang, and Chinese authorities in China because all these Europeans were still there.
And within this thing, Mao was a master conspirator who was not, he didn't start out as the head of anything, but he clawed and climbed and conspired and tricked and murdered and betrayed his way up the Communist Party hierarchy.
Yeah, really miserable.
Yeah.
So then, the spy chief of the Soviet Union's Red Army sent the infamous agent Richard Sorge to China to set up an intelligence network. Sorge came from Germany and was considered a companion of Karl Marx, disguised as a journalist and correspondent for the Deutsche Getreidezeitung. That's like a regular paper for growing vegetables and corn and stuff. And representative of the German Chinese Society. He acted under the alias Johnson or Jonsen. Various organizations were used as camouflage, such as the Soviet Merchant Navy. Kang Sheng may have worked directly for Mr. Sorge. Apparently, Mr. Sorge was.
And by the way, because Germany became, after the Long March, after the communists were kicked out of the Kuomintang and went north to form their own state in Yan'an, the Germans were an important conduit because basically the Nationalist Party had German advisors, German military advisors. German influence was growing in China because of this. And by the way, the German Orientalists, the Germans that went to work with the Kuomintang in the late 20s, were extremely popular with the Chinese. They loved the Germans loved them. Yeah. There was this very special relationship that occurred. So then for German socialists or communists to use that path to get into China was very useful for them, to use Germans at that time. And of course, when Hitler had this weird thing with the Japanese, and when it was the natural thing for Germany to be allied with China, advent of Hitler meant that this was going to end, and that Germany, because by 1937, China and Japan are at war, and that ultimately meant that Germany was not going to be with China. But there was this argument within Germany over, do we go with China or do we go with Japan? And Hitler was the one that ultimately determined that.
So then, Ursula Hamburger, the infamous agent Sonia, who later worked against the Nazis and transported information crucial to the war to Russia, was also involved in China.
And she was one of the leaders of the Red Orchestra.
Yeah, the ring. Yeah, that specific ring who got all the intel from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Mr. Mr. Sorge had recruited her for the GRU. So they knew what they were doing. Then the so-called 28 Bolsheviks arrived in China, all graduates of the Soviet-Russian Sun Yat-sen University. Wang Ming, who was only 25 years old and extremely arrogant, was considered the new rising star, Moscow's favorite boy, modeled after the Russian template. But later in 1941, he refused the self-incrimination and declaration of loyalty demanded by Mao, and soon after he became seriously ill. And so in his later book, 50 Years of the CCP, Wang claims that Mao tried to have him poisoned. In 1956, Wang went to the Soviet Union for medical treatment, never returned to China until his death. And the Soviet asset Pavel Mith pulled the strings, came to Shanghai to personally oversee what was happening, and to ensure the CCP was brought into line, was up to speed. And there was once a meeting. There was once an important meeting where the important decisions were made, and that meeting was surrounded by snipers. So this was Russia's way of ensuring the meeting went according to plan. In 37, Mif, that's Pavel Mif, was arrested by Soviet Russian intelligence. He was executed 2 years later. That happened a lot, so people should get used
Yeah,
to that.
Stalin was, again, he was purging not only the Communist Party Soviet Union, but he was purging the other communist parties around the world.
Yeah, that was nuts. Then a man called He Mengzhong and his people, they wanted to resist. They wanted to resist what was going on. They wanted to convene an alternative party congress, but they were brutally wiped out by a hit squad. So a comrade is not just a comrade. So they also may kill you really quickly. And so the British and the French were able to weaken the CCP in China to such an extent that the urban territory became too hot for them, and they had to switch to the strategy of gaining more foothold in rural areas. Kang Sheng went back to Moscow, to basically intelligence headquarters, to pick up his new orders. So these Soviet schools, the Soviet schools were like factories that continued to churn out revolutionaries, like on an assembly line. And
in fact, the same thing. The leading American communists would go to school in Russia for a year or two to learn what they had to do to be communist leaders. That was normal.
And they would test these young assets. They would test them at parties with young women, and they were trying to get secrets out of them to test them if they were really reliable. And there was no real loyalty. There was no real friendship among these guys. So there was one guy who betrayed his fellow students, or ratted them out, and he hanged himself out of guilt. Because this was expected of him. If you see something, you say something to the specific people, your handlers.
Yeah, you're supposed to rat out your own father. That was the famous Pavel Morozov.
But once you do that, what does that do to your mind? And so this one guy killed himself out of guilt.
Yeah.
And Mr. Stoyanov from the GRU selected the suitable Chinese who corresponded to his ideas, and the most elite of the cadre schools was in Moscow and was attached to the Comintern's International Relations Department. That's a funky name for that place. Guys like Zhu Enlai, Chen Yun, Peng Zhen, and Kang Sheng had special status and were trained directly by the GPU intelligence service. And also Koreans, Mongolians, and some Japanese were also educated at the...
Now that's very interesting that they were trained by the GPU and not trained by the NKVD or well, you said GPU. Sorry.
It was at some point it was the OGPU. They changed the names all the time.
OGPU, yeah. So that was in the 20s. I forget which years it changed to OGPU, but this is basically if they're trained by them, they're agents of that agency.
Yeah.
So that means that they're in they're under the Soviet, intelligence.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. So they're not just members of the Communist Party of China; they're members of Soviet state security.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like the same with military training. If you train soldiers to certain standards, you can then plan a military operation because you know what each individual soldier is capable of. So you know this factor, you know that factor. And if you don't have the standardized training, your planning could go off the rails because these soldiers do not perform. Same goes with these intelligence operations. You want to take over China, you want to have this assembly line, this factory of revolutionaries that perform.
Right. And the other thing is that these people knew they didn't have the strength to take over China without help from Russia.
Yeah.
So if they wanted to ever hold power, they needed to go along with the Russians because the only way they were going to ever have power in China is with Russian help.
Yeah, and of course, these Europeans who were active in China, these so-called concessions, the Germans, the French, the British, and so there was also spy war going on, of course, where the Russians or the Soviets were trying to infiltrate these European circles in order to be able to protect the Chinese communists. So that's a whole nother.
And at the same time, the Russians were infiltrating Imperial Japan,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is interesting because later one wonders what we know with the manipulation in Operation Snow, which was to get the U.S. and Japan into a war, but how much we still don't know the story of how much Soviet espionage had to do with getting China and Japan into a war, which
yeah.
ended up turning into the war between the U.S. and Japan.
So then, uh, various troops were assembled, or were troops were prepared in Russia under Kang's leadership. Troops which would then join Mao's guerrilla forces. Kang and Mao remained fairly close allies for decades, and um, uh, so of course Mao was also a control freak, and Mao had the credit of being a leader in the guerrilla struggle. But Mao had to rely on the Comintern. That was fairly clear. And some additional expertise was provided by the German military advisor Otto Braun, who had been trained at the General Military Academy of the Russian Armed Forces and was sent to Mao as some sort of a minder, apparently. And this so-called Long March was a retreat that was later turned into a heroic myth. And
Yeah, they were kicked out of the Kuomintang and they had to go somewhere where they weren't going to be arrested.
yeah,
So they went
and
to Yan'an in the north.
so tasked with conducting counterintelligence around Mao, Kang Sheng was in a key position to plant agents working for Soviet agents, so just to make sure that everything works the way Moscow wants it to work. And Mao was permanent all the time. He was dependent on Soviet military equipment, diplomatic cover, and equipment or training, and so even if Mao had indeed planned to separate from Russia at a later stage, he would have been in a very weak position, because this is an ongoing struggle, because you can't just have the revolution. You have to defend the revolution against all these internal enemies and foreign enemies. So the dependency goes on. He would be forever dependent on Russia. So this is something that people need to be really, really aware of. It's not like you get help for the revolution and then you say, see ya to the Russians. It doesn't work that way. And because then of course the Americans tried to gain more intelligence under General Joseph Stilwell. The United States wanted to set up an American-Chinese secret service that was Operation Dragon. And Donovan from the OSS created yet another such organization, and was also allowed to use the network of the British SIS. That was Operation Clam, for those who want to look that up. Assisting was OSS agent Cornelius Vanderstar. After the Japanese defeat in World War II, Stalin gave the Chinese communists a bunch of weapons that were also badly needed by the Chinese communists. So on October 1st, 1949, Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China at the Tiananmen Gate was now the dictator of a country in ruins without a modern economy and technology. Russia, on the other hand, already had an automobile industry, an oil industry, modern power plants, steel industry, and
Could build tanks and ships.
Exactly. So,
an interesting side note about the Russian industry. Did you know before Barbarossa, Stalin was planning to build a huge navy with massive battleships.
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah, and in fact, they had to break them up when Hitler invaded. They had to break those things up because they couldn't afford to continue building them, and they needed the manpower that was going to go into that navy. They needed it to fight at the front because they were so desperate. But that's an interesting strategic sidelight into the intention of Stalin. You know, you look at China building a blue water navy. Stalin wanted a blue water navy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, Mao's only visit to Russia is consistently cited by historians as evidence of the great rupture between the two countries. But rather
Yeah, they
than
like to say.
charting,
They also like to say that Mao was treated like just a Chinese servant when
he had to
he came to
wait in this,
Moscow.
he had to wait in this shack
Yes.
and all that stuff. You know, it's
Yeah.
just like great theater there. I mean, people have to remember Mao. I mean, at a later stage, of course, Mao. He liked the luxury. He liked to be naked all the time, or you know, most of the day he liked to be naked and stuff. He liked
He was a
luxury.
peculiar
Yeah.
person. He
Um,
also appointed his bed. He was very superstitious, and he adhered to all these Chinese superstitions, like sleeping with his feet and head pointed in a certain direction. I forget which that is. You know, all the feng shui stuff. And he was steeped in ancient Chinese magic and superstition. You know, pagan superstition. Very curious.
yeah. So, rather than charting his own course, Mao adopted Stalin's approach of decades past, using massive purges to dispossess landowners and force collectivization at lightning speed and destroy private companies en masse. This is exactly what one would have expected from someone who unconditionally implements Stalin's wishes. So nobody was more Stalinist than Mao, really. So, I mean,
Yeah,
this,
and in fact, when Khrushchev denounced Stalin in his secret speech in 1956, the Chinese party was mum about it. They didn't want to. They didn't
yeah.
want to bring that up.
Yeah, and also, I mean, Stalin got into a lot of trouble because of this lightning speed collectivization and the way it was handled and how crazy it was. So this thing didn't really work back then, but Mao repeated this exactly. So that's how
Yeah,
loyal
and
Mao was to Stalin.
and I should mention the Soviet farm collectivization system was implemented in China under Mao at first. And it only kind of came apart during the Cultural Revolution when Mao wanted to get the spirit of the Chinese people, the youth, into Marxism Leninism. You can do anything you want, kind of, magical thinking. That sort of disintegrated that Soviet-made bureaucracy in agriculture. And one of the things that happened was that Soviet agriculture in China was desovietized under the Cultural Revolution. So it was a kind of liberalization effect of the Cultural Revolution. And when the Communist Party went to try to impose, you can't sell grain, you can't do this or that, the peasants just would ignore the government. And they
Yeah.
didn't because the peasants were so numerous, they didn't have the secret police, they didn't have the resources to control them. So they just ended up giving up. And that's really what happened even before Deng Xiaoping came to power. That's really what happened. The liberalization in China was spontaneous because the population, the rural population was just so big.
So Mao acted like a total puppet. But because Mao was allegedly given the cold shoulder during his visit to Russia and was parked in a country house, many historians ignore all relevant context and perpetuate the legend of the rupture. So in and of itself, socialism could have been introduced in a different way under Mao, which would not have totally alienated international companies and investors.
Well,
So,
the truth probably was, let's look at Mao for a second. Mao was, if you talk to a Chinese person who grew up under Mao, people my age, and I've had friends that were Chinese that had this background. they worshipped Mao because Mao was, a lot of people in the West don't realize Mao was a great poet. He had an amazing mastery of Mandarin. He had the Chinese culture down. And so he had the golden pen, the golden tongue. And so this charisma, this cult of personality with Mao was extremely strong. So strong, in fact, that Mao could just have no official position and go against Liu Shaoqi, who was one of the top Communist Party officials in the 60s, who was persecuted during the Cultural Revolution, and go against elements of the party and the bureaucracy to underscore that his power was really culture power, and that this was what Mao had. And so what we don't fully appreciate was this cult of personality that everything was built on. That later the bureaucracy then under Deng Xiaoping had to kind of adjust to and adapt to even after Mao's death. So I might want to, throw that into the mix.
That was something. That was certainly something.
And the Korean War period. Are you going to cover that at all?
Yeah, it's coming up in my notes here.
Yeah. Okay.
In 1955, just 2 years after Stalin's death, there was an agreement whereby Soviet Russia supplied the Chinese with an experimental nuclear reactor and allowed 100 Chinese technicians to undergo training in the USSR. And top Chinese scientists who had gone to the US were brought home for these purposes. And in 1959, Moscow kind of canceled the nuclear deal, ordered technicians home.
Supposedly, but what's interesting is in 1964 they got the bomb.
And
so how did that happen?
Enough alternative experts were made available from the GDR. That's Soviet Eastern Germany. We call it the DDR, but so they brought these scientists from Germany over there. So these experts were made available from the GDR and other places in Eastern Europe, such as Klaus Fuchs, who originally worked on the American Manhattan Project to build the first atomic bomb. Now, some people might ask, why was this guy free? Well, he did go to prison in Britain. I mean, he was lucky he didn't get caught in the United States, because that would have been super high treason, and that would have been the end of him. But he went back to Britain, then he was caught, he was put in prison. I think it was 14 years or something of prison time, and after like 9 years or 12 years, he was let go. He went to Eastern Germany and continued to work, and then he had something to do with the Chinese program. I mean, that's how crazy this is, right? I mean,
and so if East Germany, if the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, was under Moscow, how could it possibly happen that somebody at that level who'd worked on the Manhattan Project, coming from East Germany, could help the Chinese develop their bomb after the split?
Yeah.
Right? How could that be?
And so, various Soviet consulates in China were closed. This was part of the big show. And Kang Sheng, who owed his career to the Soviet intelligence service, had some fake raids carried out, and 24 KGB spies were arrested. So that was basically theater. Nikita Khrushchev said in his memoirs that the Chinese officer Gao Gang had always thoroughly informed the Soviet Russian intelligence chief Beria which Chinese revolutionary leader thought in what way. And Kang Sheng, ironically, Kang Sheng had been Beria's student. That's interesting. Sheng had also traveled to the Spanish Civil War to hunt down dissident left-wing anarchists on behalf of Moscow. That was probably part of his training.
And the other thing that Kang did was that he was, the whole time, even after the split with Russia, he was collaborating with these Germans and the Czechs and the other Eastern services in spying on NATO.
Oops.
Yeah,
That's
which is a fact, and of course I can cite that for people. Roger Felliget, The Chinese Secret Service: A History. It was published in 1989, and also the Soviets, the Czechs and the East Germans were giving China precision equipment needed to make nuclear bombs in
yeah.
the 60s and 70s. And this was reported by the London Times in 1976.
Yeah, because I mean they needed these large particle accelerators. They call them a cyclotron, I believe. These were like
Yes.
60 tons of precision equipment. These particle accelerators and all that stuff had to be made in a very specific way. And Mr. Kang Sheng gave the impression that he was no longer dancing to the tune of the Soviets, but he lived in Beijing very close to the Russian embassy. And Peng Dehuai was still attending the Soviet Military Academy in 1957 and wanted to renew the Chinese military. He was not such a big fan of Mao. He complained to Khrushchev, but was then cut off. He was then removed from his post. Wasn't
No. The Korean War. It's very interesting. Kim Il Sung was a Soviet military officer, and he was sent by Stalin to take charge of North Korea. And in 1950, armed with T-34 tanks and other Soviet weapons to invade the South. And of course, how that war developed was the U.S. Marines came in when South Korea was almost defeated. They were almost pushed into the sea.
yeah
Way in the south, there was this enclave that was just barely hanging on by their fingernails as the Soviet-armed North Korean Communist military was trying to take the whole peninsula. But then MacArthur came in, landed in Incheon behind the North Korean army, and of course enveloped them through this naval landing, destroyed the North Korean, basically routed the North Korean army, and went all the way up to the Chinese border, the Yalu River. And this is when, unexpectedly, the Chinese volunteer army, more than 100,000 strong, intervened in, I think it was November 1950, when it was cold, very cold winter. Snow was falling, and because of Chinese infantry infiltration tactics, because of the lack of concern for logistics, that they would push on through
yeah
without worrying about supply lines, they enveloped, flanked, isolated, destroyed a lot of the UN forces. The U.S. was fighting under the UN, and you had Turkish, you had Australian, you had American and Greek, I think even Greek, troops fighting all kinds of different allied forces, but mostly American and South Korean forces fighting in that. And the Chinese had this tremendous push. And of course, you had air support from the Soviet Air Force at the same time. This is a time when MiGs and U.S. Air Force
yeah
were actually having dogfights. Of course, the MiGs were not really able to compete that well. And where we strictly ordered our military, do not go into China, even though China had attacked us.
yeah
In Korea, we were not to, MacArthur said, I don't know how to bomb half a bridge. Don't bomb the bridge where it's on the Chinese side of the river, right?
Oh,
And
come
his brother,
on.
I don't know how to bomb half a bridge. What are you talking about? And this was, and of course, despite our air power, despite all of our technology, the Chinese, this primitive army of bolt-action rifles, and the mortars didn't have stands. They used a man's back who would
They were
obviously get
freezing. They were
burned.
freezing like crazy.
And they were freezing to death, and they were starving, but they pushed them forward anyway. China lost 1 million men in the Korean War.
Wow.
And there's Golitsyn says, and other defectors relate, that there was an increase in tension between China and Moscow because China was making this enormous sacrifice for the communist bloc. And of course, it was on Stalin's, directive that this was all coordinated. And Stalin was, plotting a World War III scenario at this time. He was contemplating general war. And when Eisenhower got elected in 1952 and was entering office in early 53, Eisenhower was going to expand the war into China and go after China and Russia if they did not make peace in Korea. And Stalin's orders were, don't make peace. Just
Yeah.
frustrate any peace. They had continuous peace talks with they had this particularly annoying North Korean communist negotiator who would it's very humid climate there. He'd let flies crawl over his face and he wouldn't wipe them away. Everybody else is going like this to get rid of the flies. And this guy's letting them, and he's like, he's showing, and he's just standing there coolly smoking a cigarette, letting the flies crawl over his face and just creeping out the other negotiators. But it was Stalin died in early March 1953, and of course, some of his bodyguards, who later, survived into the 1990s, came out with the story that on the night Stalin had his stroke, Khrushchev removed Stalin's bodyguards. The only night Stalin wasn't protected was the night he died of a stroke. So the speculation that Stalin was poisoned. The stroke or whatever happened to him was induced, and he died. And of course, there was a power struggle between Beria and Khrushchev. And of course, the generals Timoshenko and Zhukov took Khrushchev's side, and they got rid of Beria, who was the head of the state security, head of the Ministry of State Security, and they dissolved it. They demoted the MGB into the KGB, from a ministry to a committee. And then, of course, there was this is when the high period of the Soviet military, when it had a kind of equal say, and had a lot of political strength. And of course, but this period of the Korean War was described as a period of tension. So that when Khrushchev came in, after they got rid of Stalin, and they made peace, they told the Chinese and North Koreans, make peace. Don't let Eisenhower bomb us and use anthrax on China, which was what Eisenhower was planning to do. He was going to escalate the war. And there was John Lewis Gaddis in the one of his books, The Long Peace. They have released the Eisenhower transcripts of national security meetings. And he's got the transcript where Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles is saying, "Oh, you were bluffing in 1953." Eisenhower said, "No, I wasn't. I was going to go to World War III if those jerks didn't come sit down with us." And of course, they knew that. The Soviet intelligence had penetrated both the Republican and Democratic administrations enough to know that he was not bluffing, that they were loading the anthrax on the submarines. And this is one of the reasons I think they overthrew Stalin. And there's a history here by a Russian biographer of Stalin saying, yes, Stalin was planning World War III, and his colleagues overthrew him because they didn't want to go to World War III, and he was going to purge them all, and they knew it.
Yeah. So
the doctor's plot was just the beginning of a larger purge of Stalin, and so.
Yeah, Stalin survived. Stalin survived for so long, and there were so many opportunities to get rid of him, but it finally happened.
And then, of course, Khrushchev had to go and ultimately meet with Mao. And of course, what did Mao want from the Soviets? You know what he wanted. He wanted a giant navy.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to invade San Francisco and Manila. He told his generals in 1958, I want to build our navy and our army so the PLA can land troops in Manila and San Francisco.
Oh boy. Yeah. Now they have a big navy, but we're gonna talk about that in a bit. So Sheng, Zhou Enlai, and Lu Zhao attended the CPSU National Congress in Moscow, where they played a bit of theater. So they were shouting.
Yeah, that was in 1960. Yeah.
Yeah, they were shouting and stuff. So to influence or to influence world public opinion, to make people believe in the charade. Of course, they were all professionals. They were all hand selected and trained, and they were smart enough. If there was real concerns, they would talk about this behind closed doors, not in a public setting. So this was most likely theater. Theater, and right-wing circles in the United States were skeptical. Like, for example, James Jesus Angleton of CIA counterintelligence, who feared the obvious scenario that the Chinese and Russians covertly constitute a single communist bloc. But then under U.S. President Nixon, and especially with Henry Kissinger, it was argued that aid to China would provide a counterweight to the USSR, which made no sense at all. And
No, and in fact, it was Golitsyn's defection a year after this charade in Moscow, at this Communist Party meeting of all the communist parties of the world in Moscow. Golitsyn defected with this information that they were planning a fake split.
yeah.
And of course, it was mocked as all of his revelations were mocked as the monster plot thesis. But look, if we look at how it's played out, Golitsyn was right. He was prophetic. They have not, Moscow and Beijing are aligned today. It's not deniable.
Yeah. And also, while Kissinger was making this argument, Kissinger was also involved in these Bilderberg Group meetings where large corporations were represented, and of course these corporations, they wanted to do business, and these corporations were told it's okay if you sell to Russia because eventually they will become a normal country. They will become compatible.
Yeah,
they will become compatible. We call it Wandel durch Handel because it rhymes. You have progress and change through trade. But this is sort of the ultimate contradiction. On the one hand, Kissinger said, we'll help the Chinese because that weakens the Russians, but then he lets these companies sell to Russia.
Yeah.
What was the argument then? If you sell to Russia, this will weaken the Chinese? What is this nonsense?
Yeah. It is totally crazy, and that intelligent people would buy into it. But you got to remember that whenever you say something that's crazy to somebody, and then you're actually making it so that they might think they make money, now they have an incentive to be illogical because there's greed in there. And of course, then anybody that would come along and say, look, this is dangerous, these are dangerous enemies, you could ridicule them and you could cast them into the outer darkness. And the financial people would be, okay, that's good. He's no good. We need to go trade with these folks.
Yeah, and I mean, these corporations, these American corporations, they were these American corporations, they were tasked with making products. So they were not, it was not their job to understand all this geopolitical stuff or to be involved in intelligence. Yeah. So they relied on people like Kissinger telling them it's okay. We got this figured out. You just sell your stuff. You're covered. It's all going to work out in the end.
And they have this magic word that sounds sophisticated. They call it engagement, a policy of engagement. We have to engage with the Russians. We have to engage with the Chinese, which means trading and cooperating and making treaties and making agreements, which, of course, they would violate at their convenience, the Chinese and the Russian side. And it was only when it worked for them, but not for us. And they would steal and cheat and make funny, you use linguistics and say, well, the treaty doesn't mean this. Just like, when with the Budapest memorandum attached to the non-nuclear proliferation treaty, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, says, by invading Ukraine, we didn't violate that agreement because that agreement just doesn't say, although it does, that we can't violate Ukraine's borders. It says we can't use nuclear weapons on them, is how he reinterprets the wording of it.
Right? Oh boy!
So he claims by invading Ukraine, we didn't violate the Budapest Memorandum, right?
Not everybody bought the charade back in those days. American media entrepreneur Henry Luce was convinced that Mao was totally dependent on Stalin, and also. Alfred Kohlberg saw Stalin behind Mao. He was a textile clothing importer and friend of Joseph McCarthy. So there we got some common sense. And then I got some notes on Mao's infamous Red Book. They also call it the Maoist Bible. and it's a lot of gibberish. It's a lot of borrowed ideas and borrowed just all this stuff that we've seen before that he took, and
Yeah,
he was.
they're different. They're excerpts from different speeches and talks and lectures that Mao had given over the years. This is where you read political power comes out of the barrel of a gun as one of the little, and they're just little snippets throughout the little red. It's called the Little Red Book, and of course I have a copy of it here somewhere. And it's a good reference material because it kind of gives you an overview of Mao's thought.
Yeah, so he was telling people that subordination is the key to everything. He said we must purposefully train tens of thousands of officials. We need hundreds of first-class leaders of the masses. So there again is the assembly line of revolutionaries, and the revolution, of course, is permanent. It never stops. He was making that clear, and of course, then came all the the mass murder and basically killing all kinds of people that were not fully on board or people that were not needed. And they implemented the same kind of snitch state that Stalin had built. So everybody had to snitch on everybody, and there wasn't even a class of rich landowners like the communists had always talked about. This simply didn't exist that way in China at the time. So they had different kinds of systems of producing grain and producing all kinds of other goods, and they were just they were progressing in their economy. And so all this European crap from the days of Karl Marx, all this crap didn't really apply to China. This was a completely different setting, completely different country, but they sort of made it fit. So they forced it upon the Chinese people, even though it didn't make any sense. So if you owned anything, you were deemed a kulak, basically a rich landowner, somebody who exploits other people, and you were the enemy now, and you had to be destroyed. And so this basically trashed the Chinese economy because many companies were shut down, foreign investments dried up, and they were left with this almost medieval type country. So you had this ruling party, and everybody else was just a serf. It's almost like somebody pushed a reset button. So you turn China back to a medieval status, and then you establish communism, and then you have this sort of communist program. And so then they tried to export the revolution even further. The North Korean communists were also under Russian control. The future dictator Kim Il-sung had lived in Manchuria for many years and received his training at a cadre school of the Soviet Union's Red Army in Vladivostok. And so that was that program. Mao's right-hand man, Liu Shaoqi, toured Soviet territory, met with Stalin 6 times and held meetings with top ministers. He brought home hundreds of Soviet advisors, and everything was Sovietized.
Very interesting. Yeah, the Liu Shaoqi was a very important party official during the Cultural Revolution, and he was very visibly targeted by Mao as setting the stage for Kissinger coming. Liu Shaoqi, I think, died in 1969. Being hounded to death. And of course, this is right when Nixon becomes president in January 1969. So this is very interesting, the relationship between the persecution of Liu Shaoqi, this big, very close to Moscow, Chinese communist official being persecuted by Mao, and the bringing in of this Kissinger and Nixon relationship.
Yeah. So then, um, as um, as one would expect, these Russian advisors occupied the most luxurious suburbs and clubs in China, sat in all ministries as monitors in key positions. This deep penetration of China by Russian secret services was almost basically irreversible. So,
Yeah, I mean, even during the split, the Soviets maintained a level of military relations with the PLA that in 1977, the Soviet military attaché in China, Colonel V.I. Soloviev, hosted a big reception in Beijing, if you could imagine that. And the Chinese visitors in this reception celebrating the birth of the Red Army included Deputy Chief of the Chinese General Staff of the People's Liberation Army, Wu Sunshuan, and Deputy Commander of the PLA Garrison, Li Chengqi, and Deputy Director of the Foreign Affairs Bureau of the Ministry of National Defense, Chang Ping-yu. And more illustrious, I could go on about how many top Chinese officials attended this big party held celebrating the Soviet Army
yeah.
in 1977 in Beijing.
So then there's I got a quote here, and this is from the book about Kang Sheng. It says here, in every area, from state security, urban infrastructure, cadre training, economic development, ideological work to heavy industry, China copied the Soviet Union. Copied the Soviet Union. So the Soviet news agency TASS became the main source of information in China, and the so-called Sino-Soviet Friendship Society, with 120,000 locations, became something of a lodge system. So they had 120,000 of these centers of this friendship society. And of course, as the Korean War began, the presence of Russian troops and equipment in China increased. The Soviets provided the tanks, the military experts, the puppet Kim Il-sung, and whatever else was needed to invade South Korea. And so that was basically kind of the whole program. So people noticed that Stalin's portraits were everywhere in China. So you look into a newspaper, and it's basically the Russian news agency, and you got all these friendship organization lodges everywhere monitoring everything. So at some point, the infiltration or the control by Russia, it's forever. You know, you cannot even if you want to break free, even if you have sort of a movement inside of Chinese, if you had a movement inside of Chinese communism that said, well, couldn't we do it in a nicer way? Couldn't we, change things and stuff? They couldn't exist because they would have been found out very quickly.
There's an interesting, there's a literature that's grown up of people study the history of the Soviet Union, and that with Khrushchev consolidating power, Stalin's method was to constantly purge communist cadres, of course, not only in the Soviet Union, but in China and other communist countries. But under Khrushchev, that policy ended. And there's been lots of commentary because the Khrushchev, he talked about collective leadership, getting rid of the cult of personality. He talked about, look, we're not going to massacre other communists again. And that this began the rot within the communist movement, that Stalin's killing of other communists was essential for the movement to move forward. And of course, it's sort of like when you no longer have a gun to your head and you are a cadre, you're a leader, you're in the leadership cadre of the Communist Party Soviet Union or of China, then it is an invitation to a kind of corruption. That is, you can now steal, you could abuse your office because remember, these guys were not elected. They're not, how are they held responsible? That was the problem in the Soviet system. How do you hold bureaucrats accountable in a system like that. And of course, it was very famous under the Soviet system. The bureaucrats would say, well, how is Stalin checking up on me? I'm just going to lie. And famously, they would lie about what they were producing. So they would have their statistics were all wrong. And of course, Stalin, in a way, encouraged the lying. He didn't want to know the truth because, like when they had the population count, I think it was 1937, it was like 10 million short of what Stalin wanted because he'd killed so many people. And so they just shot the whole Census Bureau. They just put him against a wall and shot him, formed a new Census Bureau, and they figured out, why did he shoot the previous one? He must want a higher number, right?
Yeah.
So this is what is dysfunctional in these systems. Although Stalin, he wanted you to understand when to lie and when to tell the truth, right? So he would shoot you. He shot one of the heads of his Air Force just before Hitler invaded because he said, look, the factories are turning out aircraft that are crashing and they're killing our pilots. And these guys over here making the aircraft, they're lying about the quality of the aircraft that they're putting out. They're putting out aircraft that are dangerous to fly. Stalin had him shot because all the other bureaucrats making the aircraft saying he's lying to make us look bad. The crashes are his fault because he's not training the pilots right. So
So,
Stalin had to decide who to believe, who was lying, right? And probably they all were lying. And they all
so,
trying to blame each other.
so with all this background, how can anybody seriously doubt what the defector Golitsyn had said? I mean, this was always very obvious to me. And when I recently reread Golitsyn's book, I thought he's not. It's worse than he knew. It's
Well,
even
he
much
presents a
worse.
lot of he presents a lot of evidence in New Lies for Old, which was published in 1984, for this secret coordination on the political and diplomatic level. Talking about the scissor strategy, a division of labor between the, I mean, you can see it in that the Chinese and the North Koreans come in and they're doing Zimbabwe, right? And the Soviets are helping the ANC and they're helping the communists in Angola. And so there's this division of labor in Africa.
Yeah.
And then you see it also with the Shining Path in Peru. And you've got, the different, they have almost divided everything up. And you go do this area like India and Pakistan. Pakistan supported by China, India by the Soviet Union. And yet there's evidence of coordination, as Golitsyn points out, between China and Russia, that they're coordinating it to exploit, to get the most, to
Yeah.
squeeze the most out of Pakistan and India. Just like, what was it, the Pakistan-Indian War of, what was it, 1971, right? Where Pakistan and India went to war. Was that 69? What year was that? You remember? I think it was
I don't
71.
remember that.
So you had China and Russia posturing again, being enemies with each other, and yet they were really exploiting India and Pakistan respectively, because the more China came in to help Pakistan, who needed the help, the more China was able to infiltrate then Pakistan's military, security, and government structures. Same thing with the Soviet Union in India. So so both sides, of course, were very needy of the assistance. And of course, all the efforts of India to sort of move away from dependence on Russian military equipment to start to import American military equipment. It's like Moscow is like, no, don't let them do that. And then you've got the curious assassination of the younger Gandhi, of Indira Gandhi, and then her son was blown up by a terrorist in a bomb. I think he was killed. She was shot to death. So that not only was Gandhi assassinated, his daughter and his grandson, am I remembering those relationships correctly, were assassinated. And I think it was part of, my guess is, don't know for sure, but my guess is, look, when you see assassinations, which is a pattern, the Soviets regularly engage in assassination, it means that these people are going off the track prescribed by the Russians.
Yeah. I
And to
mean,
guide them back on, they have to kill a leader, bring somebody else in.
if we imagine a high-level meeting, in a secure conference room, right, and they just did the revolution, they just took over China, and in this conference room, what would they talk about? Would somebody say, "Okay, comrades, I think we should publicly show the unity between Russia and China. I mean, what would the other guys in the room say? Are you nuts, comrade? Are you
Right.
insane? We
Right.
cannot show that. Just we wouldn't get international trade. We would get massive problems if we did that. We can do that
That's
at a
right.
later stage, but not now. Are you? I mean, what is this
And
guy
look
in
at
the room?
the
Who let
yeah,
this
and
guy
look at the
into the room?
benefits. Yeah, look at
Who
the
who let
benefits
this
of
guy
having
into the room? This
America.
is stupid.
Yeah.
But this idea has become sort of the mainstream notion of these countries being separate. But in this hypothetical conference scenario, if anybody had suggested that, he would have been, he would shut up real quick, because
Yeah,
it's
I mean
just
the communist bloc, if you think of it, it was a bloc. And the kind of the intermutual dependence they cultivated and the training and they didn't, all these communist countries didn't automatically do what Moscow wanted all the time. Moscow would have to negotiate at times, would have to cajole, sometimes assassinate, sometimes, it's like the assassination of Ceausescu. When you read The Hole in the Flag by Andrei Codrescu, he discovers in his investigation that Ceausescu was overthrown by Moscow in
yeah.
1989, not by a spontaneous revolution of the Romanian people. So that even then, so Ionescu comes in, and what is he? He's a school chum in the Soviet Union of Gorbachev. You know,
I have these
so
so
it's
I have these quotes, some select quotes here from Golitsyn's book, and I really think it was much worse than Golitsyn even knew, because he says, for example, this: the earlier decision to disclose all former Soviet agents in China to the Chinese has been fully enforced with no exceptions. And then it says the role of the advisors, meaning the Russian advisors, was limited to advice and coordination. Interference in the internal administrative affairs of the Chinese services was ruled out. The Soviets really treated the Chinese services as equals in status, if not in experience. Come on, right? I mean, it was
well,
probably much worse than that.
Golitsyn claims that Khrushchev wanted to. Khrushchev thought that Stalin had ruled all the other communist parties with an iron hand and had damaged some of the relationships, particularly the relationship with China. Golitsyn makes the argument that Khrushchev had to come in and heal the relationship with China. Uh,
Treating them with more
act
respect.
Right, treat them, and in fact, he did that with the Communist Party USA. When Khrushchev came to the United States, he apologized to the Communist Party USA, saying, we apologize for bossing you too much and commanding you too much, and And you know what the response for the Communist Party USA leaders was? No, comrade, you don't need to apologize. We needed your help and your guidance. So don't
Okay.
ever apologize for that. Yeah. So in China, I think they had to be a little more careful, and it's very hard for us to understand this relationship, this closeness. It was Marina Kalashnikova when I interviewed her, and it's still online. You can listen to my interview with her. She explained that China and Russia were still run by these same cadres, these communist cadres, and this was, this interview I did with her was what, 2010, 2010 or 11. And she was saying, look, they're both essentially communist. And that hasn't changed. And they want to do these things because they are in the same spirit. It was, they used to use the phrase Soviet China to refer to China in the
Hmm.
1950s. And so they're part of the same world party. And we have to remember that they can't, on a basic political level, they can't compete with the West. They can barely compete with the West as a bloc of countries.
Yeah.
And if they're known to be a bloc, the West gets frightened. I mean, even now, since Russia's aggression in Ukraine, the Western banks have pulled out of Russia, and they're decoupling from China.
Hmm.
And this is, I watched a lecture by uh, Peter Zahan, who gave this, China's doomed, and I know other Wall Street banker that consults with the Committee on the Present Danger of China was saying the same thing. He says China's going to collapse in 18 months. Zahan gives them 10 years. If they do
Yeah.
everything, they manage things well in China, which they're not. But it was some of these guys that I've talked to, some of these economic guys, are saying that Xi Jinping is a real follower of Mao Zedong. And Xi Jinping is just autocratically, systematically destroying the Chinese economy. Just like, by the way, and we could talk about this, that also Putin is destroying the Russian economy
Yeah,
because the
he is.
decoupling of the West from China and Russia is catastrophic for their economic development. They're going backwards now, both countries.
So now moving on to the present day. This was a recent story, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, and they were talking to intelligence professionals, and it was about the insight into China, because years ago some spy networks just virtually disappeared. So lots of people were arrested or just vanished. And a couple of factors were blamed for this. One was the CIA's communication system. So they were supposed to have systems that were separate from each other. But there was some digital traces somewhere, and these systems could be linked. That was one aspect that led to the downfall of some of these spy networks. The other factor was the wholesale theft of American data by the Chinese. So if they steal everything in terms of data, they can use algorithms on the data and sort of figure out in America who has a security clearance, who fits a certain profile, who maybe be involved in secret work. And so this makes it harder and harder to send someone to China, try to meet with people, and try to make something happen. And so this recent story says this: Beijing's spy catchers all but blinded the US and China a decade ago when they systematically rounded up a network of Chinese agents working for the CIA. As many as 24 assets providing information to the US were executed or imprisoned, among them high-ranking Chinese officials. The CIA is still struggling to rebuild its human espionage capabilities in China, the agency's top intelligence target, according to interviews with current and former US officials. The gaps leave the US with limited understanding of secret deliberations among Chinese leader Xi Jinping and his inner circle on key security issues such as Taiwan and other topics. As a quote, "We have no real insight into leadership plans and intentions in China at all," said a former senior intelligence official who until recently read classified reporting. Yikes.
Yeah, we're blind in China because we're so terrible at human intelligence. They always roll up our networks, they double our agents back on us, or they execute them or imprison them. I mean, that's the way it's always been for us.
And so at the same time, we see these massive information operations targeting the U.S. We talked about this various aspects of this before. So the slogan is, we have to forgive. Especially this is popular among some conservatives, especially the MAGA types. They're being told we have to forgive Russia, we have to support Russia because Russia now supposedly is conservative, even though it's run by the KGB. And by working with Russia, we can focus on China. But if these two countries are linked, that strategy is total garbage.
Right. It's the same thing. I was told, I had a long talk with a guy that worked in the White House this week. I don't have permission to give his name, but it was interesting. He worked in the Trump White House. He worked for a long time in the Pentagon as a strategist. Very knowledgeable guy. And when I asked him what he thinks the deep state is, he says it's the communists. They're trying to take over the U.S. government. very frightening. But on this particular issue, he said that, and this was the misguidedness of the Trump administration, that Michael Flynn, when he came in as national security advisor to Trump, his thing was, he admitted, like in his book Field of Fight, he admitted that our enemies are Iran, China, and Russia, for example, but we need to divide and conquer them. We need to take them one at a time. Well, that's very naive, because that assumes that they're going to let us do that.
Yeah.
They're going to let us play that game. And of course, what happened to Flynn? It wasn't past February of 2017, and all these accusations came against him, and he was kicked out and prosecuted and almost put in prison. So it's like, he's an enemy of. He stated that the enemy was Russia, China, Iran. And that's the one thing they don't. And of course, this poor guy, he got railroaded too. And other people that I know that worked in the Trump White House in the National Security Council setting, they were kicked out, right? So this was a thing that if you understood who the enemy was, your career was over if you crossed a certain line.
Yeah, I mean, there was this New York Times story. This was a few months ago. This was right after the weird coup d'état attempt by Prigozhin in Russia.
Yeah, last
the
June.
Wagner, the former Wagner mercenary leader, and the New York Times basically said they didn't want to be too explicit, but they pretty much said that we have to forgive. We have to forgive Putin. We have to somehow end the war in Ukraine and forget it ever happened. We have to continue to work with Putin because there's nobody else, and anybody else would be more dangerous. And if we put too much pressure on Russia, it would fall apart. And then we have 5 Russias, and they may be more dangerous. So this is kind of...
good grief.
Yeah.
5 Russias would be fighting each other, and you'd be fine. You'd be able to squeeze the raw materials out of Russia that you would need, and then you could actually, if you had a normal country in Russia, the Russian people could have a decent life. Or if you had 5 normal countries in Russia, you could have a decent life. It's this Russia as this monster power that is so negative, and that is what the monster is. And if we don't, we're in this really dangerous period of world history where Russia and China have decided to go for the one clenched fist that Golitsyn predicted, that now they fooled us. We haven't built a nuclear weapon in more than 3 decades. We haven't even tested one. And Russia and China are just building them like sausages. And although their economies are coming apart at the seams, and their conventional militaries don't work properly because they're still relying on outmoded, operational art of war concepts. They got the nuclear weapons, and since they're failing, and they know we're still stupid and they've infiltrated us, their big temptation is to use these nuclear weapons to blast their way out of the situation, the dead end that they've put themselves in. Yeah. That's a thing to really be afraid of.
And we recently learned, actually in Germany, of all places, we recently learned that Wagner's internal chat system, the encrypted chat system, was hacked into, probably by the Americans. So this came out in the press because of this court case right now in Germany against a high-level traitor or suspected alleged traitor. This was a man. So
could this be the reason for dissolving Wagner? The real reason?
Well, it's just this high-ranking guy at the German Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND. This guy is suspected of being a mole. He supposedly, allegedly sold all these secrets to the Russians. And so the BND, the German intelligence, they're terrible when it comes to human intelligence, but they're pretty capable in terms of technology. And so,
like the Americans, yeah.
Yeah. So this is where the intelligence is gathered by the Germans, and somebody, maybe even the Germans, they wouldn't exactly say who was successful at hacking into Wagner's internal chat system. But
Did they
just
say what they learned by doing that? They
no,
didn't
no.
mention that, did
I
they?
mean, you saw the press coverage right up to the beginning of the court case, the court proceedings, and so then they couldn't even read the whole indictment without sending out most of the people inside of the courtroom because it's so
So they had
secret.
to they had to make the court secret and block the press and
Yeah, they
everybody out
threw
and swear
everyone.
everybody to secrecy.
They threw everyone out, and there hasn't been. I don't think there hasn't been a new report in the press about this case in like 2 weeks. So if you regularly check the news, it's just dead silence. And we learned that.
Do you think the leaders in Germany, because of these kind of intelligence gathering, realize that Russia is so dangerous? I mean, but then again, you mentioned this week that German military readiness since the invasion of Ukraine is
Yeah,
lower, is getting worse,
yeah.
not
I
getting
mean,
better.
I've seen a bunch of intelligence reports over the years that appeared in select books, people who had these sources, and these reports are generally pretty good. I mean, it's not that the intelligence service is so good. It's just that they collect stuff on their own through technology, but they also get stuff from partnering, agencies, and so they assemble these reports, and these reports are then sent to the political leadership, and it's just I'm dumbfounded at these decisions on a political level when these politicians are informed on a regular basis, not just by German intelligence, but also by the Brits, the Americans, the French. It's maniacal, and so we learned that Wagner was hacked, and so we also had some reports out of the United States about how American intelligence had also somehow penetrated Wagner, and they learned about these coup d'état plans like weeks earlier, or some maybe even months earlier, and so
Or that they were fed that.
yeah,
A leak. They could have
yeah.
been allowed to hack in, and then, this
So
is a
if
trick that the Russians do:
so
feed them
if
fake information.
So if even the Germans had supposedly learned stuff about Wagner internally, you would have to assume that Russian intelligence was also informed about this weird stuff brewing inside of Wagner. So maybe they found it out.
Let's break that. Yeah, let's break that down. Maybe they found that out. Let's break that down. Maybe they didn't find it out. Maybe it was a provocation, which is my suggestion. Look, you had this all happen. Is it a coincidence that this happened when the Ukrainian summer offensive was about to begin, or
Yeah,
in its early days? Is that a coincidence? Because the success of that Ukrainian offensive depended on the intensity and tempo
yeah,
of the assistance that Ukraine was going to receive from the U.S. and Eastern Europe. And this Prigozhin coup, tell me if this isn't right, is feeding into this
yep,
Russian propaganda that, oh my God, if Russia loses the war and breaks
yep.
apart, you're going to have 5 dangerous countries and it's going to be a chaos. And who's going to control the nuclear weapons? And oh
Hmm.
no, and then they're more afraid of Russia losing than Russia taking over Europe.
Yeah,
Right,
and
which is
it was
absurd.
always. I mean,
But
even before the coup, I found it so strange that this Prigozhin guy was allowed to say certain things in public. I mean, people were killed for a lot
yeah,
less
that
than
didn't
this
make
guy
any
said.
sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
he
And by
was
the way,
running his
why?
mouth. He was running his mouth. Nothing happened to him. He does this
Yeah,
weird coup d'état, and then the New York Times quotes this coup, and they explicitly refer to this coup and say, well, we have to live with Putin because everything
yeah.
else would be too crazy.
Because the takeover of Russia. See, so it seems to me, just looking at the pattern of, if you use the Golitsyn, new methodology, so called, if you look at the Prigozhin coup, if you use that methodology, it fits exactly in the disinformation and the outright propaganda narratives. that Moscow is feeding the West. Be very afraid if we get overthrown, if Putin gets overthrown. Be very afraid of the crazy bull in the china shop Russia that would emerge, because however bad Putin is, he's the guy you know, not the guy you don't know, who's going to run crazy. And so, oh yeah, well, I guess we better, appease Russia, because we'll get something worse if we don't. And so it seems to me that whole Prigozhin coup was just to reinforce that line of argument.
Yeah. And here's another quote from this recent story. I believe it was the Wall Street Journal. It says, they talk about an older intelligence assessment concerning China, and this was a very scary assessment. And then the report, and then it says in the report, several officials said the analysis was largely ignored by President Barack Obama's White House, which hoped that as China grew economically, it would liberalize and join the US-led international world order. That policy had been followed by Democratic and Republican administrations for 2 decades. Quote, there was a lot of desperation to believe that, said Gail Held, former CIA East Asia analyst. Well, I mean, it's just, this is sort of the universal excuse. We were hoping for it. We were, we were desperately clinging to this idea. I mean, these guys are professionals. They're not supposed to have wishful thinking. They're supposed to gather, real assessments here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing, is they're not doing any strategic thinking, and they don't know the mind of the enemy. So they don't know the pattern of disinformation of the past and how it repeats itself. So there's no pattern recognition. They never learn anything, and they never get the context right in any current event. So when they're following in real time events in China, events in Russia, they reliably come to the wrong conclusion. They got a lot of the information, a lot of the data points that you and I have. They always misread them. And it's the same thing with why the conspiracy narratives are so important as an add-on to mislead people. I saw John Newman. He's written an interesting new book. He's one of the JFK conspiracy guys, and he thinks he was Pentagon overthrew JFK. But he was one of them. All those JFK people were like, Angleton is evil, James Angleton is evil, Galitzin's a false defector, all of this. And this guy suddenly starts looking they knew they had a mole in the CIA and the Kennedy administration. There was a mole hunt, and he realizes there really was. And he's not a bad researcher. And he suddenly, he does an interview, I think it was Jones's podcast, not Alex Jones, I think it was his name, Tommy Jones podcast. And he says, look, I was wrong. This is very nice to hear. I was wrong about Angleton. I was wrong about Galitzin. There was a mole, and he actually names a guy he thinks it is. And of course, he had corresponded with Pete Bagley before his death, and I had a relationship with Pete Bagley too, who was a CIA guy who had brought in Nosenko. And so now he's getting on the right track. I wonder if he's going to go back on his JFK assassination stuff. But it's... But in listening to Newman, I thought, where Newman has always gone wrong is in terms of his larger picture of the world and how it works. He still hasn't understood the communist movement and how it works and how pervasive it is, how it exists in all the countries, how the Soviet Union worked, how China worked, not knowing how this mechanism functions, that it is a mechanism. That it is not just the personality of Putin or the personality of Khrushchev or Stalin, that as important as these individuals are, Xi Jinping, it is all in the context of this machine. The house that Lenin and Stalin built and Mao built, it is one house. I think that's the real message. And they can't see the pattern. They can't see the ongoing deceptions and games and manipulations and active measures that are still going on.
I posted, I think this was yesterday. I'm losing track of time. I posted my review of the Oppenheimer movie, And I also got the book. It's right over there. It's the book that was the basis for the movie. And I was thoroughly shocked at how bad this movie was, because it's almost like the Soviet interpretation of the Oppenheimer saga, right? I mean, at this point in time, we have enough information about Mr. Oppenheimer from the Manhattan Project and his many communist relatives, friends, acquaintances, the wiretaps, the intercepts. I mean, he wasn't fully nailed as a traitor, but he brought these traitors into Los Alamos, and communists were chatting about him, so they were mentioning him as one of their own, and he was in a sort of a front organization for the Communist Party in America. And so the evidence is against him. He lied to the commission. He said, "Oh, I didn't know this one guy. Was it Serber or was it the other guy?" He said, "Oh, I did." He lied to his the officer in charge. He said, "I didn't know this guy."
Leslie Groves. He lied to Leslie Groves.
Yeah, he said, "Oh, I didn't know. I don't know this guy. I don't even know what he looks like. Can you tell me what he looks like?" And then later under oath, he admitted, "No, I know the guy. I met him like 6 times, and we had dinner, and there was this other communist present and stuff like that." So he was deliberately dishonest.
Perjury, by the way.
Yeah,
it's felony perjury, and you're covering up for a Soviet agent, basically.
Yeah, and he was falsely blaming this Elton guy, and he was trying to throw the spy catchers off his tracks. I mean, the evidence is so much against him. I mean, at the very least, he had to lose his security clearance. But then I watched this movie, and I'm reading the book, and I'm thinking, what is going on?
So the movie, let me get this straight. Since you read the book and the movie, did they take liberties with the book and change the story in the movie?
Well,
since
according
very few people are going to read the book compared to the number of people who are going to see the movie. Right?
I can tell you this. According to the book and according to the movie, Oppenheimer was the victim. You know, he was a victim of the evil fascist forces in America. He was the voice of reason. He wanted to limit the nuclear program, put it under international observation and all that kind of nonsense. So he was the voice of reason, but all these, evil right-wing people were working against him. And so he was the fall guy after, Klaus Fuchs and the others got caught. I could not believe what I was watching. I mean, it's almost the Soviet interpretation of the whole saga, because when that happened, Fuchs was discovered, all these others were discovered, Oppenheimer got in trouble. Immediately, the Soviets launched an information operation depicting Oppenheimer as the victim and just playing down the atomic spies and delivering this narrative. It was okay to spy to stop America and to balance out global power. So I could not believe what I was watching.
The book and the movie are whitewashing Oppenheimer.
Absolutely, 100%. I could not believe Mr. Nolan would put out this movie. I mean, if McCarthy was still around, Mr. Nolan would be in trouble. I mean, serious trouble. So there's this.
Well, here's a question for you here, Alex. Why, after all these years, after decades, I mean, we're talking about the Manhattan Project, that's, 1945, that's more than 70 years ago. Why maintain a Soviet lie now if the Soviets lost the Cold War and if we can tell the truth and if the communist agenda is still not on the plate? Why lie now? And why lie on a major motion picture that people are going to see, and they're going to take their lessons of history from that?
So right? the movie Oppenheimer guy. So the character in the movie is very suave. He's very cool, and they do show how he tried to poison his university professor with an apple, where he injected poison into an apple and placed that apple on the desk of his professor. So they show that in the movie, and it's a weird side note in the movie. And he ultimately removes the apple, tosses it in the garbage, and nobody ever finds out about this. But actually, if you read the book, they give you some more background. This actually was causing quite an incident, because people did find out about this. And Oppenheimer, or Oppie as he was called, he was deemed to be mentally completely unstable. And he had to, his rich father, because he grew up like a prince, his rich father had to pull all the strings. He had to be treated by the best psychiatrists in the country to avoid criminal charges and to have him continue his precious career. And this was not the only incident. He also tried to strangle a friend with a rope or a belt. So he tried to kill his friend with a belt, and he failed, and then he cried, and he was collapsing, and he collapsed all the time, by the way. And he almost killed a woman who was riding along in his car, because he was a crap driver. He was very reckless, and he caused an accident, not the first one. And the woman on the passenger seat was passed out, and he thought she was dead. So this was the real Oppenheimer. He was diagnosed as some sort of a schizophrenic, and he had severe depression. He was a complete loon, and but they kept him at these universities. And of course, at the time, the Soviets were targeting people with a Jewish background by telling them, look, communism is the best anti-fascism. So
best against defeating Hitler. We're fighting Hitler with millions of soldiers.
And they said, oh, by the way, there's also fascism growing in Britain and in the United States. The military-industrial complex and all that stuff. So there's these fascists running around, and communism can stop them. And so this is how they recruited people with a Jewish background. And so then you get to the scene in the movie where Oppie talks to the man in charge of security at Los Alamos, I believe it was. So this officer, right? So these both men talk, and Oppie is very evasive, like always. And so after this conversation, Oppenheimer talks to his regular officer who he works with. This guy's played by Matt Damon, so he's sort of the good guy. And Matt Damon's character is telling them, look, Robert, you got to be really careful with that guy, because his family is from, Tsarist Russia, and this man, he killed communists with his bare hands in Russia. So, and I'm like, so what? This was a war over there. What do you expect? But they cast this guy. They cast an actor as the head of security with blue eyes and this Nazi type, this weird type haircut. So he looks like a Nazi. He looks like a fascist. And they say, oh my God, he killed communists. And what?
Yeah, no, I have a friend who's a nuclear physicist who knew some of the physicists that were old timers, and he went and saw the Oppenheimer movie. And what's interesting is that he was kind of disturbed at the suave image that they gave Oppenheimer, because what he was told is that Oppenheimer was a misfit.
Yeah,
he was socially inappropriate. He didn't know how to act. He was just inappropriate, and he wasn't popular. He really wasn't liked, right? He was weird.
Yeah.
So it's funny that they romanticize him in this, and this is just typical of what Hollywood. We've seen so many movies where the guy that's anti-communist, the guy that's defending America, is the evil guy,
fascist. Yeah.
Right. Like what the movie War Games, was it in the late 80s, about how America is going to cause a nuclear war and we're the warmongers, and this is straight out of Soviet, central casting. This is Soviet propaganda in our movies shown to our young people.
Yeah, I could not believe what they had actually put on the screen. So they also show sort of a friendship between Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein, and they don't tell you in the movie, as far as I remember, they don't tell you that Einstein was a communist and he was not allowed anywhere near the Manhattan Project. And they regularly talk with each other, and this is also how the movie ends. They talk about, oh my God, this is very dramatic and all, but the real Oppenheimer didn't even like Einstein. He called him a total lunatic, and that's even in the book. So they fabricate this friendship, and interestingly, both of these guys came out of what do they call it? The ethical movement. I have this in my review. This was sort of an international type network. It was in Britain, it was in the United States, and in Britain it was tied to the Fabian Society, the famous left-wing group. Yeah. And in America, there were, Einstein was part of it, and Oppenheimer, when he was young, he was visiting this, or he was attending this school that was part of this ethical movement by Mr. Felix Adler. And Felix Adler was, there's a quote of him where he says, the root cause of evil, he's talking about the West, the root cause of evil is the commercial thinking. So that's straight Lenin, that's straight Marx. It's the very same kind of argument.
Putin has the same ethic.
Yeah, and so like, what is this movie? What is this movie? And so they show you how they develop the atomic project, and they're racing the Nazis, of course. But when the Nazis are defeated, it's sort of implied. I mean, they don't specifically say it, but it's sort of implied that fascism isn't over. There's also fascism in America, and now America has the bomb. And so, that almost sounds like a pitch for a recruitment, a Soviet recruitment. We have to fight.
Well, of course, they've indoctrinated this whole generation of Americans. I mean, when I talked to this guy that worked in the Pentagon and the White House this week, who talked about the deep state, he said it's all these younger people come up through the universities, learn their Marxism in school, and this is what's happened to us. And I heard Neil Ferguson interviewed recently talking about this, saying that statistically, a third of all the young college people are pro-Marxist, pro-communist, pro-socialist, and only 10% could be said to be, not for it, against it, with the others all easily swayed to go the way of the larger number, the 30%, or that is for it. But then who are they recruiting into government? You got to realize that the communist movement is a minority of communists who are orchestrating and promoting people and judging their loyalty and making useful idiots out of this group, browbeating this other group and guiding the country on this socialist path. This is how they've gotten into the Justice Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, the White House. They're in the White House. I'm sorry, Mr. Biden is one of them. And they are working with the Chinese and the Russians, even if they pretend to be against Russia. You can't believe it. So, it is the same thing in Germany. Germany is the same as America in this.
And you asked the question like 2-3 minutes ago. You asked the questions. Why would they put this movie out like now when the Manhattan Project was so long ago? Because there are more traitors now, and this is sort of the underlying excuse for current traitors that are being exposed and future traitors, moles, that are going to be exposed. Because you even see briefly Klaus Fuchs in the movie. There's a short glimpse. Oh, what is Fuchs doing? Oh, there's Fuchs. Oh, hi, Fuchs. And then, sometime later in the movie, they reveal that he was exposed as a communist spy, and it's just glossed over. Or it's sort of implied that it's okay because it's important that you have a balance of power. And it's important that Stalin, of all people, got the bomb earlier because of these moles. So it's a baseline excuse for all traitors in the current era. So the next generation of Oppenheimers and Fuchses. And now you have this. This is also from a recent story. It says the story talks about the successes of Chinese espionage. It says the successes included Kevin Patrick Mallory, a former CIA officer who had become deeply in debt and sold secrets for cash, including the identities of U.S. intelligence officers due to travel to China. Mallory was convicted in 2018. And in August, the Justice Department revealed the arrest of 2 U.S. Navy sailors charged with providing military information to China. Both were U.S. naturalized citizens born in China. Wenheng Thomas Zhao pleaded guilty to 2 counts in October. Jin Chao Patrick Wei pleaded not guilty. So this is an ongoing problem, and now people see this stuff in the cinemas, and they think, well, it's okay if people spy. It's necessary to fight fascism.
Yeah, and they don't understand. This is the thing. You look at the autocratic societies in Russia. You look at Russia is slaughtering the Ukrainians, trying to destroy Ukrainian and slaughtering their own Russian people. And they're building up nuclear weapons. They're threatening war with, there's been a number of things coming out how Putin is going to go on. There was the threat to Uzbekistan last week that was made by a Russian senator. There has been threats to Poland that even have come out of the lips of Putin himself, threats to the Baltic states, threats to the rest of Europe. And with China, all of the things in China show they want this larger war. Well, they don't have the economic wherewithal. But why this nuclear story is so important about the Manhattan Project, Major Jordan's diaries we haven't mentioned, about how we were sending material to the Soviet Union during World War II for them to make their bomb project, to actually make a nuclear reactor and so on, for which to make the material to make the bomb. That all of this ability of China and Russia to have nuclear weapons, that's their ace in the hole. Yeah. That's the only thing they have is missiles and bomb technology. And you look at the trash, the rubbish that their society produces, and the oppression and the demoralization of their people. And now the demographic collapse in Russia and in China. In China, it's going to be the biggest, worst demographic collapse in the history of the world. And that the malinvestment, the collapse of their financial system, the collapse of their economy, because they're both of these countries are trying to turn to the one clenched fist to basically take us over and to rule the world. But everything is turning to muck in their hands as they're doing it. And the only thing they have to reach for now to get themselves out of it is the button, because they got this thing from Oppenheimer and the Rosenbergs and Klaus Fuchs and Harry Hopkins. If Major Jordan's diaries are correct. So who was the co-president who lived in the White House with FDR. I mean, the spying has just been potentially fatal with war-winning implications for Russia and China, because if you win a nuclear missile war, if you defeat the West, you could end up ruling the world. But my evaluation is you're just going to make a mess out of the world, and you're going to collapse into cannibalism because your system doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, in books like Trinity, you get a lot of background on the Klaus Fuchs case, and we mentioned some aspects of it. Like, for example, how he wasn't caught in Britain before he went to the United States. So the Brits told the Americans specifically, we vetted this guy. Klaus Fuchs is safe. You can just let him work on the atomic project.
That was, Sir Roger Hollis's work.
Yeah.
If we go by Chapman Pincher, if we go by, I think Peter Wright would have agreed with that because he thought Roger Hollis was a spy. Yeah. And this was what Roger Hollis, as an MI5, security expert, was supposed to be watching against. Mm-hmm. And I refer to the book Spycatcher by Peter Wright and of course Chapman Pincher's book Treachery. And
it seems so. I mean, in hindsight, I mean, it seems that it would have taken only reasonable resources to protect against Klaus Fuchs, because he was almost caught several times. He worked on the tube alloys project, as it was called in Britain. And then he was moved to the United States. And in America, he had this handler who was kind of lazy. So they would set up these meetings not too far away from Klaus Fuchs's apartment. And they were regularly meeting in the same area. And so at some point, Mr. Fuchs became very concerned about the level of tradecraft presented here, because he said, look, I'm in America now, so the laws are much stronger here in America. It's my butt on the line. It's like death penalty danger here. So would you mind picking some more secure spots and show some more variability in your meeting places, please? And so this was, I mean, it didn't take rocket science to, secure against these sort of things. And if you look at Oppenheimer, he was, he bought this place, this farm, I think this New Mexico farm, very remote, and he would go on these very long riding trips. I mean, this was fun to him for some reason. He would sit on his horse and ride for hours. So, I mean, this is sort of the stuff we saw other traders do. Like, for example, the famous German mole Heinz Felfe. He bought this remote location at the border of Germany and Austria, because he was always meeting his handlers in Austria, so he could travel back and forth and not be discovered. And so why would Oppenheimer buy this remote thing, this remote place, which was really miserable, and take these long and ride his horse for hours? I mean, you could literally ride your horse for 4 hours in this direction, meet with your handler, and then return to your farm or this place that he bought.
And of course, this disturbed personality is the ideal personality, Oppenheimer, to be a spy, because he's abnormal. He needs a fake sense of identity.
He needs a family. He needs a better family. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, what is the KGB doing? They're propping. What does a KGB handler do? He is morally and psychologically propping up his asset. Oh, you're doing great. You're doing good. Don't worry. Don't be downcast. Here, have this and have that, and cheering him up and being like a counselor friend to him, and feeding his ego and building him up. I mean, that's what they do with these kind of folks.
Yeah, and there was, in the book, they mentioned this incident at a summer camp when he was a young teenager. So some of the boys in the camp were doing something, I don't remember what it was, they were not supposed to do, and he reported on them. So he basically snitched on them. And so his father then, I think he reported it to his father. His father got involved and talked to the camp people. And so the boys got their revenge. So according to the book, they grabbed young Oppenheimer, removed his clothing, put some paint on him, and stuffed him in a what's it called, a meat locker, or some sort of a very cool room, a cool room, and stuffed him in and let him and locked him in for the night. And some people describe it as sort of torture. So maybe that was also an event that led to his mental breakdowns in his later years, or in his 20s when he was at the university.
They might have done that to him because he was already a psychopath and abnormal, and they did that to him because they just hated his guts, because he was awful. And
he lived like a prince. He was visiting the most elite universities. He always had a nice apartment as a student, with a nice view, and he was always brilliant, and was never really that much pressure on him.
Let me ask you, from reading, was he really a brilliant physicist? I mean, was his contribution to physics really significant? I mean, what was he in that regard, or was he just a fraud?
It's complicated, because I mean, I'm not into physics, but the way it is described is that quantum physics was so new that you had to make progress in little steps. So he would put out many papers in those university years and make a name for himself, and everybody thought of him as really, really smart, but he was really inept when it came to laboratory work. So he was what would Jews call him, a klutz or something? So he was very inept in the laboratory.
Well, Americans use that expression, klutz. It probably, okay. What does it come from, Yiddish?
I think so, but he was so inept they wouldn't let him anywhere near a laboratory, and he broke down in the lab a couple of times because he hated that work and he was not good at it. He was good enough, but he always made specific types of progress, and he didn't seem really all in, because he didn't know where this is going to go, and he had many interests. At some point he wanted to be a writer. He wanted to study ancient languages and stuff. He had many interests, so physics was not really his love child, so to say.
Well, let me ask you this question. He got his bachelor's degree was in chemistry, wasn't it? And
Yeah, it's
then
true.
he went to Germany, went to university in Germany, and studied under Max
Göttingen,
Bohm.
Max Born, yeah, in Göttingen.
And he got a physics degree, and he ended up at UC Berkeley.
Hmm.
Am I right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, this is really funny because one of the history things that we know was that they detected Soviet activity at Berkeley around
Mm.
at UC Berkeley in I think 1943. Involved because Berkeley was involved in the Manhattan Project, saying that there were Soviet agents coming to the homes of people involved at Berkeley. Maybe it was Oppenheimer, and this was the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, called the White House to tell FDR, and it was Harry Hopkins that picked up the phone
Mm.
and said, "Well, the president's busy. Why don't you tell me?" So J. Edgar Hoover told Hopkins, we've caught this. The Soviets are spying on the Manhattan Project, and let the president know, at Berkeley. And it's interesting that Oppenheimer's a Berkeley professor. I wonder
Yeah.
what the details are. But what happened is Hopkins went immediately to the Soviet embassy and told them that, hey, the FBI knows that you're spying on the Manhattan Project.
Well, at
And
first,
he was caught. And of course, what's amazing is that J. Edgar Hoover was furious when he found out that this is what was happening. And he wrote a letter, which Dinah West refers to in her book, American Betrayal, saying, look at what this guy did. And of course, when confronted by it, Harry Hopkins, the co-president, lived in the White House with FDR, said, well, the Soviets are our allies against the Germans. They needed to know.
oh God, oh God. Well, at first Oppenheimer studied in Britain, and supposedly he did not like it there. Then he went to Germany, which he liked very much, which is kind of odd because Germany is a strange place, and so even
What
especially
university in Germany was he at?
I think it was Göttingen. It's one of the old ones, really really old ones, and
Did that really have a good reputation for physics? Was he really going to become an ace physicist there?
well,
I
they
mean,
did
what do you
some.
think?
Of course, there were some new talents there, and they worked on this very new field that he was interested in. But Germany was a strange place, and especially the school system, the university system. It's ancient. I mean, literally ancient. So,
And he
um,
was there, what, in 1927, 28?
let me just check real quick.
Yeah.
So
That's before the Hitler period, of course.
So yeah, I mean this was a very communist period in Germany, back in those days, pretty wild time. But so it's odd to me that he would dislike Britain and he would fall in love with Germany of all places at that time. And this is also when he started to read specific literature and at some point he was becoming an esoteric as well. There's one incident in the book, I think it's not in the movie, where he went to a certain place. They won't exactly say what happened, but this transformed him, and then he started to
Oh, was he
become.
hanging out with Hermann Hesse?
He was become a Buddhist. He was becoming esoteric and weird, and
Really?
something happened. He probably took some psychedelics or something.
Well, he does quote from Hindu scriptures, I think, when
Yeah,
the Bhagavad Gita, when he sets off the atomic test
yeah,
at Alamogordo.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so he started in Harvard. He was in Harvard first. Then he went
But
to Cambridge University,
oh, he went to Cambridge. Okay, that's
and
where he went.
and then from 1926 to 1927, he was studying at the University of Göttingen, which is very very
Mhm.
old and very strange. And of course, these universities in Germany, they were full of secret societies and spy networks. That's always been the case. And
This is where he got his PhD in physics. Is it
uh,
Göttingen?
this was sort of a, I don't know, supplemental degree or some sort,
Because
because he
his
was,
original bachelor's degree was in chemistry, I think, wasn't
yeah,
it?
he wanted to be started in chemistry, but then he switched to physics. And so at these German universities, you had all kinds of secret societies. I mean, this was, of course, like with the Bavarian Illuminati and so many other groups like this. They marketed themselves as Enlightenment. Some of them were socialist in nature. So it's not exactly clear what happened in Germany. And this is a weird thing because
he could have been recruited by the Russian intelligence in Germany, couldn't he?
Certainly, and it's just in terms of when you give him a security clearance, you need to do a thorough background check, especially when he works on the Manhattan Project. And what you don't like in a background check is really unaccounted, periods in this person's life. And so when he's in Germany, he is outside of the view of, let's say, American intelligence. American.
What American intelligence was there in 1927? I don't think we didn't have a spy service. We had military intelligence. That was all we had, and
So
I don't think they were focused on this.
So he spends time in a strange place, and we don't have much information about that time. Yet he still gets this security clearance. Now, this is not an ideal situation. You want to have all the years of his life accounted for, because he was a young man. I mean, he was an adult for a couple of years, so you want to have a good view on that specific time frame. So we're talking about the Georg August University of Göttingen. Was created in 1732, roundabout. Was created, in fact, was started by this university was started by George II, who was king of Britain, of course. So King George II started this university, and it became quite important very, very quickly. And of course, if there's leading, cutting edge science being done at this university, you would expect many spies to be there, especially from Russia. And there was also kind of these old connections to Russia, especially in Tsarist times when they were exchanging information. And so who knows what happened at that time, yet he still gets his security clearance. And it's just one of these things. And especially how they say how he liked it there. And he liked it much better than Britain, which is very odd.
Well, was Max Born part British, or did he study in Britain?
Hang on a second.
Or did he flee to Britain during before the war to escape the Nazis?
Okay, let me just check real quick. Max Born, he was okay, this is quite a bit of text here. Well, he was a big guy in Göttingen, and then World War I, he wasn't suitable for military service because of his asthma, but he was a radio operator, and so then he became a professor in Göttingen, and then he had his citizenship revoked under the Nazis, and he went to England. He taught in Cambridge, then University of Edinburgh.
Okay.
And then he returned to Germany in 1953. So.
Well, and of course wasn't he into Eastern mysticism? Max
Born?
Yeah.
I don't know that, but it might be the case. I mean, it's pretty clear with Oppenheimer that he was very interested in that stuff, and it's a secret to this day what transformed him, because he talked about the specific event changed him so much that he was no longer plagued with depression. He was no longer, in this mad hell in his own head, and we don't know what this event was. It may have been psychedelic drugs. It may have been esoteric knowledge and groups, and we talked about this in regards to General Stubblebine who was this Hall of Famer military intelligence guy, a very, very capable anti-communist. And he was depressed. I think he was really depressed after Vietnam. And so then he got into this esoteric stuff, and he made these esoteric. He did this esoteric research.
This is like opening the gateway to something really dark when you take these drugs. Essentially, I should mention something I discovered this. Nick Redfern, who we have discussed one of his books before. He's got another book which I've started to read, which is about. It starts off with an interviews that he did with an American Anglican priest in Lincoln, Nebraska, named Berkey, who two physicists, U.S. government physicists, dropped in on him, and they were working on psychotronic weapons technologies for the U.S. government. In 1994, this happened. That they were working with supposed alien non-human intelligences, the stuff that David Grush is talking about.
Yeah.
And they showed him photographs of people who died in these experiments. And that the non-human intelligence they were interacting with not physically, but psychically or parapsychologically. And that they were being guided to technologies by these beings that they were communicating with in some way, and they were told were aliens. But these guys went to this Anglican priest who had a degree in theology, who was, this is sort of a moderate Christianity. It's not Catholic. It's not, almost like they were saying, well, we're worried that these are demonic entities because everything in these experiments, people are getting killed. Nothing works the way it's supposed to. These things are like almost immaterial, very bizarre. And Redfern's got this whole book about these secret projects being connected to non-human intelligence that Grush uses that expression, are not alien, they're interdimensional, they're maybe demonic, they are manipulating human beings and killing them maliciously, maybe.
So
it's interesting.
It seems like Max Born was an activist too, not just a scientist. He signed.
An activist in what?
Well, let me tell you, he put his name under the so-called Göttinger Manifesto, and this was a declaration against nuclear weapons, specifically in terms of Western Germany, because Franz Josef Strauss and others, they wanted to have German nuclear weapons for defense.
Yeah, the German defense minister Franz Josef Strauss.
And so you had this group of people with Max Born, and they were signing this declaration whining about nuclear weapons. And interestingly, and obviously, the Soviets were happy about that manifesto. So communist Eastern Germany was happy about that declaration, and they made a big deal out of it. So they promoted this thing, because they didn't want the neighboring Germany to have nuclear weapons. So so then the scientists of the DDR, as we call it, I think the Americans call it the GDR, Soviet Germany.
Deutsche versus German, the DDR, the Deutsches. Yeah.
So the scientists, the communist scientists, they also had their own declaration and resolution, and they were picking up on that Max Born thing. So he was also an activist, just like Mr. Oppenheimer. I mean, that's also in the movie where they say he's becoming sort of a politician, or he's turning into an activist or a politician, because he got himself. He included himself in a conversation where he really didn't have any purpose, because he was not trained in security. He was not knowledgeable about security and geopolitics. He had no idea about these things. Yet he pretended to be smarter than everybody else. And this is basically the core of the Oppenheimer movie, that he's the voice of reason. And he was the fall guy because this evil establishment wanted to get rid of him because of his activism, not because he seemed like a total spy. I mean, it's that bad. So so it's
Yeah.
it's a very peculiar career that this Mr. Oppenheimer had, and of course we know about these confirmed spies, such as Klaus Fuchs. We know how they were approached, and we know how other people with a Jewish background were approached, especially after the war. The Soviets said, we made all these sacrifices to fight the fascists. We are the leading anti-fascists. And many others, the Cambridge spies and many others, they were basically approached in the same way. And it really didn't help that Britain had this deception operation against the Nazis, pretending to be open for an alliance and all that nonsense. And so this seemed like, pro-fascist leanings, and so this made the job a whole lot easier for the Soviets to recruit people. So that's how that went.
Well, that just gets worse and worse, because now another element of our history has been falsified in the movies, and that all these young people who don't really read that much and don't have the wider context are going to be misled. They're going to think that their country's evil, that Oppenheimer is a hero, and that all the people that leaked the secrets to Stalin were heroes, just like they think Edward Snowden is a hero, or Kim Philby maybe. They'll even think he's a hero. When these people were traitors, and if our country is destroyed, if our cities are blasted, if we suffer a nuclear biological war, and hundreds of millions of people die in the West, it's going to be who helped this along.
Yeah, and we talked about this earlier in this show about how the Chinese sent their people to Germany and to France to be trained by established communist networks, because this was a safer place for them to train. And then they were shipped back to China. And so we know that these networks existed, and Europe really was the breeding ground for communism. And I have some notes about that. So for example, there's this. Socialism became a serious movement in Germany when, most people were still thinking of socialism as just an idea, very simplistic, very primitive idea. But there was already networking going on, things were happening, and there were many, many assets. Some of these guys are not very much known outside of Germany, but here these names are still remembered. There's like, for example, the Socialist Party here, the Social Democrats, who are in charge right now of Germany. They use these names for their headquarters or their foundations. So they call it the Karl Liebknecht House or Foundation or something like that. So
he was an associate of Karl Marx, Karl Liebknecht.
Yeah, Karl Liebknecht, Marx, this, that, Rosa Luxemburg. So all these German characters, these names still persist. So, for example, you had this guy called Ferdinand Lassalle. So he was an asset.
Yes.
He was 20 years old.
He was a contemporary of Marx's as well.
Yeah, he was 20 years old, and he got to know the 40 years old Sophie Countess von Hatzfeld. Sophie Countess von Hatzfeld. He met her in Berlin, and in 1861, Lassalle and the Countess went to Italy and met the revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi, who collaborated with Giuseppe Mazzini to take over Italy or unite Italy. And the Countess Sophie von Hatzfeld was called the mother of social democracy for her contributions to the movement. So she basically funded these groups that later morphed into these political parties, especially the SPD, which is now in charge of Germany. So that's what they call her, the mother of social democracy. And so there's this weird help that some of these communists received from some aristocratic people. So this was sort of seed money that became very much a problem over time, because this communist thing then just grew and grew and went all nuts, and then of course,
because people don't. There wasn't really a distinction. If you go back to before this revolution in Russia in 1917, there wasn't a distinction between communists and socialists. They were really the same thing.
Yeah.
The German Social Democratic Party, they were Marxists, basically, most of them. And so it was, in fact, Lenin was part of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party. So they were social democrats. That's what communism and Bolshevism came out of, social democracy to begin with. And that was what these people were pushing. So, beware social democracy. And of course, it really is, with the Fabian Society and all that they were doing, there is this attempt. It is the new religion, is what I call it, that's going to take over. And it's about this thing that Hayek talked about. It's really about bureaucrats and so-called experts having a planned economy, directing all economic activity. Excuse me. And it's this is from Friedrich Hayek's New Studies. It's an essay called "The New Confusion About Planning," and it's about socialism. And he says, it's a regrettable but undeniable fact that economics, more than any other scientific discipline, is liable to recurrent fashions and fads, the periodic reintroduction into professional discussion of popular superstitions which earlier generations of economists had successfully driven back into the circles of cranks and demagogues. And that's what we go. I mean, we're always learning that, wait a minute, socialism is just a strangling of your economy and the collapse of your society. And yet we always end up, now under the Green Movement, we're back at it. The socialists are finding every avenue they can to control us, to lock us down and pauperize us. And the whole time they're blaming capitalism, they're blaming the big corporations, they're blaming them for pauperizing us. No, it's the socialists.
Yeah, and so
all these scientists, like you're talking about Oppenheimer and Fuchs, why and Einstein, they all fall for it.
So I've been over the last couple of years, among other projects, I've been chasing communist collaborators in earlier times. So because the way Germany functioned, you just have to realize, when you get somebody from an aristocratic family, when somebody decides to help the communists, or to have a partnership with them, or just to basically join the communist movement for whatever crazy reason, the communists would not just get money from that particular aristocrat, like this red or communist baroness, the mother of social democracy. They would not only get money, they would get contacts. And if that aristocratic person also had intelligence networks, the communists would then inherit or get access to these old aristocratic intelligence networks. Especially at the universities, because the universities were run mostly by the aristocracy. So imagine if early communists, these broke people, these broke communists, they get help from an aristocrat that could get them into the universities. And then you have a professor. You can have a professor at the university, and then you can scout new people, and you can recruit new people, and then you can basically infest that university. And so this was a very big problem in Germany, and of course that's why I'm so interested in Mr. Oppenheimer's time over here at Göttingen. If I was in charge of handing out security clearances, I would have had the great reservations about Mr. Oppenheimer spending basically an entire year at a place like Göttingen, and you don't know what happened there. You don't know who he was in contact with, what meetings he visited, what was going on with that man in that early in his life. I mean, he's only been an adult for a couple of years, and there's an entire year he spends at this weird place. I wouldn't give him a security clearance. I mean, he could work on You could work on some theoretical physics stuff, but you wouldn't give him a security clearance. I mean, especially.
Why did Oppenheimer get picked to head the lab
Yeah,
there
that's a
in
strange one. That's a strange
the
one. I mean, he was.
bomb project?
I mean, part of it was his networking and his connection he had to other scientists with a Jewish background. I mean, he wasn't much of a believer. He became sort of a Buddhist later on, but he could talk to other scientists with a Jewish background, and that may have gotten him further ahead in the game, because he could convince his superiors that he could handle these people and they would all do their jobs, and he could spot the talents and they were really needed to push this program forward. But I mean, there were so many talented people involved in the Manhattan Project. I mean, there were so many sharp minds.
You couldn't do it. One person couldn't do it. I mean, you
No.
needed a huge number of brain power to collectively organize. You had to have good organizers, and you had to have engineers, and you had to have people that could actually go through all the steps and make the thing. But it's interesting, this esoteric, I want to get back to that for a second, this esoteric connection that that is in Oppenheimer, and that you going back in Germany to the secret societies, to
Oh boy. Oh boy.
Heinrich, what was his name? Cornelius Agrippa, right? You know, this guy from the 16th century. That they get into the occult, they get into this, and they're very influential, and they develop some political thoughts too. And that the fact of that, now you progress to the modern era and you find this pervading politics. You find, you got the Thule Society in there in Munich. You've got the Hitler movement, associated with this. You've got the SS collecting through Italian scholars, through Julius Evola, this massive file on all the esoteric groups and lodges in Europe that they collect in Vienna, and then the Soviets take it over. And then you mentioned how the communists were interested in these things. The communist intelligence were interested in these things in the 20s.
Yeah.
So you've got these professors like Oppenheimer experimenting maybe with drugs, because they've known that these drugs, the use of drugs to have quote unquote esoteric spiritual experiences goes back to antiquity.
Yeah.
Right? The Delphic Oracle, the priestess of Apollo at the Delphic Oracle of Apollo, she was breathing some kind of toxic thing that gave her these hallucinations, that made her into an oracle, right? She was channeling something because she was in an altered state because of exposure to chemicals. You've got that drug in the Amazon jungle. What is it called? Yeah, ayahuasca, that these people take. This Graham Hancock talks about all the time, that you meet some kind of non-human entity, right? So then I wonder, if the government is, and this goes back to these secret societies in Germany, scientists actually going into altered states to get technology from where are they channeling this? And look at the bomb, how evil a technology it is, blowing up things. Did we get the bomb because we were given the bomb by non-human malevolent entities gave us that?
Yeah. I mean, people can nowadays, of course, people in the United States, they can, grab an internet device and get on YouTube and look up some of these places, like the Göttingen University or some of these other universities in Germany, because they're so different from American universities. Because over here, these schools, they're like temples. They're made specifically at a certain ratio with certain designs. Everything has a meaning. It's so intricate. And so if you are a young student who is regarded as the next big talent, obviously you get recruited into these old societies or some of these old networks, and they try to make you happy, and they make you feel welcome, and they draw you into these things because it's almost like a scary movie, right? You go to Germany, in the 1920s or something, and you go to these old scary universities and these old creepy buildings. I mean, recently over Christmas, we watched some Christmas choir videos, right? And so this video suggestion pops up. It's this is the choir of Cambridge, I think it was. And so they have these different people in this really large hall, ancient hall, and they're singing these beautiful songs. And I'm like, this looks exactly like the Great Hall of Hogwarts in the Harry Potter novels. This is exactly taken from that building, and they turn this into the School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in these novels. And of course, J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling, she thinks she's a socialist, and she wants to be a socialist, and she really is one. But she, at the same time, she was fascinated with Cambridge and Oxford, and she wanted so desperately to get to these schools, and she wanted to be with these special people and all this mystery. And now she lives in Scotland, removed from general society. Now, as a socialist, you're supposed to like the common people, but apparently J.K. Rowling doesn't like average people that much, and she wants to separate from them. She wants to be with the special people. She wants to be with these high-ranking Scottish Freemasons and, have all this mystery going on. And it's just that specific place is the Great Hall of Hogwarts, in her mind. And then in the movies, of course, the big Hollywood movies. And oh, by the way, I think the big influence on J.K. Rowling was Jessica Mitford. She was from an aristocratic family, but she was called the red sheep of the family because she was a communist, and she helped the communist movement. So this happened quite a bit in aristocratic families. You had some people in these aristocratic families, they really hated their family. They rebelled against their families, they rebelled against for anything they stood, and they turned communists, and they helped the communists.
Metaphysical rebellion, yeah. And of course, this connection to the occult rebellion, to what Eric Berglund talks about as Gnosticism and the apocalypticism. You go to, going back to this theme that there's this occult influence on many scientists. It's surprising. We run into it now with Oppenheimer and possibly with others. But there's the Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard story, which I think we've touched on before. Jack Parsons, of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Pasadena, this rocket scientist that joined Aleister Crowley's Temple Oriental, whatever it was in L.A. back in the day, and that conducted this Babylon working using ancient Babylonian magic to manifest the homunculus, along with L. Ron Hubbard to do this. And of course, this is something Aleister Crowley had supposedly done in New York with this German woman in January 1918. And of course, there's the famous interaction when somebody tells, I think it's in the letters of Aleister Crowley, somebody tells him, look, what Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard have done. They have tried to manifest this homunculus, and he freaks out. That's so dangerous. Did they close the portal? What is pouring through there? What kind of evil? And of course, he, in his book Magic, Crowley has this vituperative, blasts people who indulge in witchcraft and casual use of magic because it's so dangerous, and they're weighing into the muck of the occult that they're going to get contaminated. These it's like the hobos of the spiritual realms are going to, the criminal element of the spirit world are going to attach themselves to you, right? And yet, ironically, Crowley was a guy that promiscuously, especially when he was younger, did this all the time. Yeah. Almost like at the end of his life, he was getting religion and going, this is really dangerous. People can get killed. And of course, he had a servant in his house that went mad. I think others just left him or committed suicide. I mean, all around these people that played with the occult, there are these horrific stories associated with them. And of course, Jack Parsons blows himself up in his home laboratory, and I think it was in 1951, making some kind of explosive. just blew his right arm off, blew his
Oops.
other arm to shreds, shattered his legs, blew his jaw off of his face, and of course died an hour and a half later in the emergency room in Pasadena there. But these people end up horrible. Horrible things
Yep.
happen to them.
Yeah, and of course
Um,
the famous British Royal Society for Science, when it was started in the 1600s, this was during the Stuart era. It was full of esoterics, Rosicrucians, and they were into all this magical stuff. And then when King George the First was around, they tried to restructure things and reorder things. So they changed the Royal Society. It became more focused on science, less on mystery cults. And then he also recreated British Freemasonry as sort of a sister organization to the Royal Society. This is something that most people don't know at all, that there's a very deep link between British Freemasonry and the Royal Society. So this was kind of the attempt to have this in an orderly fashion, right? But some of these scientists, of course, were disappointed with the new ways. So they wanted to have both, one foot placed in the scientific realm and one foot in the esoteric realm. So
Interesting. Yeah, I relate this one experience. I had a friend. He was a very bright student, very hardworking student. He wanted to be a physicist. He's a pretty good friend. I knew him from junior high and high school. And he finishes his degree, undergraduate degree. I think it was in physics or math or something like that. And he went into a PhD program in physics. And I remember he came and visited me after his first year in the program. And he said, I said, well, how is it? What is it to be in a PhD physics program? And he turned to me and goes, I'm confused. Do you believe in magic?
oh God.
And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, it's all this physics is getting into this spooky stuff. This is what he was
Yeah.
telling me. And this is 40 years ago when and it's like he was a year younger than me. And of course, he ended up getting out of physics and becoming a computer scientist. And he ended up teaching at UC Santa Barbara or somewhere like that. But he couldn't do the physics because it was getting too weird for him,
Interesting.
what they were concluding about it. So maybe this is kind of the spooky stuff is because when you're going into the ultimate explanations for everything, right? There is what does that open the door to? Then you're going to start theologizing. You're going to start looking at cosmology. You're going to start to look at ultimate things. And where do you go then with that? Do you go into this? And this is the thing about what I'm reading in these different books and these sources about the government. You got Annie Jacobson's book Phenomena, that the government has had under the term parapsychology, studying psychics, studying strange phenomenon, remote viewing. I mean, these are facts. The government did this. And now, what Nick Redford is saying is that they were using Babylonian black magic. They were literally trying to contact non-human and work with non-human entities, non-human intelligences. Well, how's that different from what you find in Ashurbanipal's library, where he's got the text for summoning the seven wicked spirits? How's
Yeah.
that different from conjuring? How is that not Chaldean, ancient Chaldean black magic? What's the difference?
Yeah. I mean, in the Oppenheimer movie, you get these glimpses, these flashes of imagery. It's supposed to represent the atoms and the electrons and so on, but it also has sort of a prophetic meaning in the movie. It's like Oppenheimer had visions of the forces of the gods, because ultimately the nuclear bomb, maybe to him, represented the forces of the gods. So we could actually access this sort of power and force. And they also mention the possibility of destroying the atmosphere with the first nuclear weapons test. Now, of course, this was a very, very remote theoretical danger, but in a larger sense, people say if you have the power to destroy something, you control it, and being theoretically able to destroy the Earth almost gives us godlike powers. So they put all this stuff in the movie, and yeah, there's so many examples of this. You have Nikola Tesla. The car company is named after him. He was an electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, and futurist, and he was also involved in esoteric societies. I think one of it's called the Ghost Club or something like that. It's a bit difficult to reconstruct, but he was also working with X-ray imaging, electrical discharge tubes, and he also built a wirelessly controlled boat, first ever exhibited. So yeah, he was channeling these forces of nature, and he was into this esoteric stuff as well, very, very much so. I mean, it was so pronounced that people started to make up all these myths about him. So in various pieces of pop culture, Nikola Tesla is named after this man who invented miracle machines and all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of fantasy mixed into this.
Yeah, there's a lot of these fanciful stories about him and what happened. And of course, when we get into UFOs, and you hear this spooky stuff about UFOs. You have the David Grush testimony before Congress, and I'm not making this up. He says they're working on technology based on UFOs. You got to wonder. Okay, it's secret, but what is the secret? What is dark in there that they don't want to admit?
Yeah.
Does it connect up with spooky stuff? Is that really what is being hidden?
Yeah, and there's a YouTube channel in Germany. This is just a guy who does these self experiments with various drugs. So under professional supervision, he takes these substances and he's being filmed, and then he explains what's going on with him. And after the experiment, he talks some more about what his thoughts were. And when he tested LSD, he was being led by an experienced guy, sort of a shaman type, and it was recommended to him that he go out and just walk and just go hiking a bit. And so he was hiking through nature, and everything was magical to him. And then he was lying down on this patch of grass, in the middle of nowhere. And he was just, he loved the grass, and he loved the sun on his face, and he was just in love with everything. And this is sort of an experience that people have described where they feel like the universe is connecting with them, and they're connected to everybody else. And this is sort of became, I think, like a pitch for the communist movement and the green movement. When people have this experience plus the propaganda, they internalize that stuff, and they think that
we're all one. We're all one.
Yeah. And it becomes
like
sort of this
Lennon
black and
song.
white, and it becomes this black and white worldview where you have these enlightened people, and then you have these unenlightened capitalists and individualists. So capitalism is viewed as selfishness. It's all about you. It's about material things. And these supposed enlightened people, they are connected to the universe and connected to each other.
Yeah.
And they think of themselves as just a little piece in a big machinery. And so
Is the hive mind really a good thing, or do you want your individuality taken away from you? Do you want to become an insect?
Yeah, and I mean, there's stuff growing in Germany that will give you a pretty decent trip. I mean, we don't have the cactus, the peyote cactus that grows in America, but we have these weird mushrooms and
magic mushrooms, yeah.
Yeah, and there's some stuff that people grow that stuff. They don't even know what it is because it looks pretty. Mm-hmm. But if you
it makes you really sick, as I understand it. It makes you want to throw up.
Yeah, there's some stuff
because
that
it's
people
poison.
Yeah, there's some stuff that people grow because it looks nice. But if you if you smoke it or you use alcohol to extract the alkaloids or whatever it is, and then you get really, really high. And so there's ready access to all this stuff over here. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm gonna try to find some more information about this Oppenheimer's time in Germany, and also the specific event that is mentioned in the book that transformed him, and he didn't have that big of a problem anymore with his depression. I mean, nowadays there's more and more work, therapeutic work, and research done with psychedelics to treat people with severe depression, PTSD. That sort of thing, trauma patients, traumatized people. And so maybe he felt like he was healing with this experience. And yeah, and he bought this ranch in New Mexico. That's where the cactus grows, right? He was riding his horse.
Yeah, cactus grow all over the Southwest. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. You can find cactus all over there.
Yeah, let me just pull this up real quick. So I'm just looking for New Mexico, and
it's very dry. New Mexico is really a desert.
Yeah,
I mean, it is desert.
Peyote, native to southern North America, mainly distributed in Mexico. In the United States, it grows in southern Texas and other places. Yeah, and he loved California. He really, really loved California, and there's a lot of occult activity in California. And I think there was also some mentioning of the Bohemian Club in the book. I have to find that. I have to find that part and look into this some more. Yeah, I mean, people take this this weird looking they consume this weird looking cactus thing, and then they talk to dead people, or people that don't really exist. Under the guidance of a shaman of some sort. Yeah, that was maybe one of the secrets of Mr. Oppenheimer. I mean, it's not the first time that scientists took drugs and were inspired by it in a scientific sense. I think some guy who found the structure of a chemical, he took some psychedelic drug and he saw these geometric shapes. He was hallucinating these shapes, and then because of his scientific work and knowledge, he had this idea, maybe it's shaped, or we can think of it like a hexagon, and maybe this and that, and so it's used as an inspiration. But for some people, of course, it becomes much more than that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Alex, it looks like we've covered the topic of China for sure, and where they've arrived at. I was going to make some economic comments about China before we finish, and that is that anytime you have, and I tell people don't want to read this, read Hayek's Road to Serfdom. There's a wonderful book by a German economist, William Röpke, and it's The Moral Foundation of Civil Society. And he was the guy that was he's been complimented as the guy that was responsible for the German economic miracle, because he was advising the German economic recovery back in the 1950s, and definitely believed in the free market. It's interesting. Röpke departs from the Austrians in saying we should not, except for special industries that are licensed, should not have businesses with more than, I think it's 200 and something employees. That you have to have small concerns because it's much better for society than having these giant ones. Very interesting guy, very good book. And of course, this book, which really is, everybody should read, and it even affected the communists who understood what he was saying, is Ludwig von Mises, this book, Socialism. And basically he says, socialism as a way of organizing society is destructionism. You are destroying your economy. You're just breaking down your society on so many ways. And he goes through it. The last part of the book, of course, discusses just how powerfully corrosive socialism is and why. And of course, von Mises is an Austrian economist in the Austrian school. and it is quite brilliant, and it's a sort of a seminal work. It's important when you study economics. So many of our modern analysts, like uh, 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 Peter Zehan, for example, everything's about economics, and they boil everything is cause and effect economics. We have to be careful about that. That's very one-sided, and it's very much the tendency in popular social analysis, because man does not live by bread alone. There's a lot more. There's a spiritual dimension. There's the military and the political dimensions, which they're interrelated. And the economic is important because we are physical beings. We need to eat. We need to have economy. But the way we have inverted economics, and socialism is this inversion into destructionism, people really need to understand. Since so many people believe, well, why is socialism is just fairness? No, it destroys your economy because people need autonomy. They need freedom, especially in the economic sphere, to create, because
Yeah.
all the material values we have are created by somebody. And you can't take that away from them and socialize it, because then you kill it.
Yeah. I mean, when real when real economists talk about the economy, they talk about concrete things. They talk about margins and production and prices and supply and demand. But when communists talk about setting prices, they sound like esoterics. It's
Yes,
gibberish.
it's
It's
subjective.
it
Yeah.
makes you feel like stoned. I mean, I feel stoned when I read communist texts. I'm like, what are they saying? How do we set the prices? How do we determine what the wages are? And then Karl Marx is saying, well, this one guy, he makes lampshades, and so he gets compensated for his work, but then he wants to buy something else like a table. So how much table does he get for his work on lampshades? And I'm like, what is this? It's like it
Yeah,
makes you feel
it's the
stoned.
communists are gods and they can determine the value of everything. And the fact of the matter is, subjective value theory is correct. It is whatever the market, whatever people want, if you make it, you'll make money. But if you make something that people don't want, if you go into moonbeam farms, who's going to buy your moonbeams, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how much work you put into it. Oh, he put so much work into his moonbeams. Nobody wants them, right? And so it's supply and demand, and it's need and greed, I guess you could say. But it's a way of making voluntary economic cooperation, voluntary, not managed by the government, not with a gun pointed to your head. That's what creates. That's what encourages people. People with a gun to their head do not feel very creative, and they're
Yeah.
not free, and it's destructive of human dignity. It destroys the incentives to work. It kills creativity. And the market, the only rational way to calculate is by the market mechanism, the free market, not the government setting prices. But what's this really worth? Does anybody want these Soviet cars? Right?
Yeah.
No. Buy a BMW, you idiot. This is what you could hear in the streets of Moscow when the prime minister wanted to be a nationalist and drive a Russian made car. His hood is open, the steam and smoke is coming out, he's blocking traffic, and what are people? That's what they're shouting to him: buy a BMW, you idiot,
Yeah.
because the Russian car breaks down.
Yeah, and it's so baffling to me that people still go back to the ideas of Karl Marx, a man who couldn't really interact with people properly and who also couldn't handle money. So this is the guy you're looking for in terms of a pseudoscience of how to interact with people and how to handle production in the economy. So, and also when he was around, this was a very chaotic time, especially in Germany, and so industrial capitalism was in its very early stages, and at that point in the 1800s, you couldn't overnight just make baseline baseline security problems vanish. So all these different empires, they were still backstabbing each other over here, and they were trying this and were trying that, and were using all kinds of intelligence operations against each other. So of course you needed stability and order, but this is what Marx and others were always. This is what Marx always criticized, these baseline security considerations. I mean, they called it imperialism, they called it all evil and the root of all evil. But I mean, this was just a reality in Europe. So you couldn't have, a perfect capitalist world overnight where everything was peaceful and nobody had to think of, these larger security matters. But most of Marx's texts is just whining. And even Lenin's foundational text is just whining. It's 95% whining about Western structures and Western capitalism. So, Lenin, the communists, they hadn't really created anything yet, but they were whining about Western structures. And regardless of all these existential problems of Western states, because they had to be mindful of security. So obviously, larger systems try to have some sort of control over industries and the growing of companies and corporations and securing materials, but just labeling everything as evil imperialism, that's just stupid. And just it seems like these people were high when they wrote this, or it sounds like somebody is high. I mean, if you ask a capitalist, what's the price of a pack of cigarettes and why is the price like this? The capitalist will say, well, we buy them at raw materials and we turn them into cigarettes and we have different levels of quality. So you can buy a pack of cigarettes for $3 or a nicer tobacco for $5, or there's also a cheaper option. Do you want one? This is your choice. We make this offer. Simple answer. But when you ask a communist, what's the price of a pack of cigarettes and why is it that expensive, the communists will go all esoteric and tell you all this nonsense about the common good and the greater of this. And it's just, do you want economics or you want people who are stoned? This is basically what it boils down to.
You want East Germany or West Germany? You want North Korea or South Korea?
Yeah.
It's, do you want China or Taiwan? You can make the comparison, socialist societies versus freer societies. And it's clear where are people materially better off and free and treated with more dignity in the free world. But that's what's demonized in these movies, in these schools, by the wokeness. They demonize what is, our society is not perfect. It's not a utopia. Of course there's problems. But you're demonizing the better and you're lomming onto the worser? That's your model? It's just insane. And these younger people, I just admonish them, read history, read some good philosophy, but don't keep reading that garbage, that Marxist or pseudo-Marxist and woke garbage.
Yeah.
Because that's what they've been feeding you since you were a kid. Don't buy it.
Yeah. Or I recommend to kids, try to make something, try to build something, not just schoolwork, you put some words on a piece of paper, but actually try to make something, come up with a plan, source the materials, and then make something. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it's just the feeling of producing something and realizing what goes into this and the whole learning curve. It's very, very rewarding if you just
the feeling
make
of owning
something.
your own business, it's very personal. I'm responsible for paying these people and serving these clients, and wow, how it improves you to have that responsibility, to be taking care of employees and clients, and to be managing it all, managing the payroll. How many people have done this? It's a great experience. Just like owning your own farm, owning your own business, it's huge. And to turn everything, what is the drudge employee of a corporation? It's not the same experience.
Yeah. And a lot of kids actually like order and structure. Sometimes they're not fully aware of it yet, but there was this moment where my daughter told me about these these WhatsApp groups. Like in her school class, they have like this chat group where they can, exchange notes and whatever for homework. And then they also have these private groups. And what you see is that some of these private chat groups, they get broken up. So people move someplace else and they create another group, and they all start to fight with each other. And so I told my daughter, this is what bad politics look like. This is what disintegration looks like. Nobody gets along with each other. Try to make something, or try to build a group that makes something. Have that experience. I mean, what did the let's say the British SOE, the Special Operations Executive, and other groups like it, what do they do in the training? They get these little groups to a lake or a small pond, and they tell them, okay, here's your materials, build a raft that holds all of these people of the group, and then you have to move the craft over the water, retrieve an object, and go and come back again. So this is when these people actually have to work with each other and make decisions and be precise and cooperative. And this is when the instructors look at these people and they find out if they are really capable of working inside of a group under pressure. Mm-hmm. Do they fall apart when they are undercover in foreign occupied, Nazi territory or something, in an occupied France? Yeah. Will they fall apart, or will they actually pull through and carry out the mission?
By the way, this you had recommended last week, Deutschland 83, and you also recommended Berlin Station. So I basically bought the Berlin Station for a season, and I watched it this week. I think it's only 10 episodes. So a little bit of a review. Very good drama, but very left wing. Very anti-CIA, very anti-American, because the hero is, of course, he's friends with a tranny, right? The tranny liberates him because he's torturing a tranny who is helping terrorist network in Europe, and he's torturing the tranny in Morocco, and he has a conversion experience, and the CIA is evil, and I need to change it from within. So he does his own kind of Edward Snowden thing, where he starts stealing secrets and publishing them through some left-wing German newspaper. And of course, this is the centerpiece of it all. And of course, a whole bunch of people get killed and their lives get ruined unnecessarily, maybe. And it shows nasty aspects of bureaucracy. We're not living in a perfect world, but it's the plot line. What I don't like about these stories, the dramas, is that they're all such geniuses. The characters do things and figure things out in real time that real people don't that easily figure out and solve problems. Real intelligence history doesn't work that way. Even the brightest spy masters and the best people, they're just stumbling around in the dark a lot more over a lot longer period of time where nothing gets solved. Of course, that doesn't work for drama, right? It doesn't really work for drama. So it is good drama, good recommendation. And you do hear a lot of spycraft terminology and you see these things, but it's not realistic. Not really.
Yeah, it's a misguided, burnt out asset who thinks he wants to get revenge against the CIA. He wants to destroy the entire Berlin Station. So he leaks classified information to a left-wing newspaper. And this whole thing he does is completely misguided, and
he's also under the thumb all the while of German counterintelligence.
Yeah,
the whole time.
Yeah.
It's like, and so it's what? Just
Yeah, it's just this. He's almost like a Edward Snowden character or a Julian Assange character. He wants to lash out. He wants to destroy.
But he's sincere. He's been sincerely converted to some kind of good cause, right?
Yeah, but
he has a conscience.
Yeah, but these people exist. I mean, we see people becoming traitors. We see people who for various reasons they start to hate the CIA because an operation went sideways, or some decision is made way above their pay grade, and they think they know the situation, but they really don't have the full picture.
And the worst murderers and the worst characters are the higher up you get in the CIA and German intelligence. They're all the worst people.
Yeah, the Germans are terrible. The Germans are terrible.
Oh, they're depicted as real villains, and so is the top guy from the CIA who comes to the Berlin station at the end of the season. Just horrific villains.
But they smooth things out. They smooth things out in the second and third season. So now it's way more positive about the CIA, and these characters become way more likable, and they sort of it gets better in the second and third season. I mean, I watched it for the drama because I wanted to see something thrilling or whatever.
It is good drama. I mean, it keeps you on the edge of your seat.
Yeah, but it gets more sympathetic towards the CIA in the second season, the third season. In the third one, they're trying to foil a serious plan by the Russians, because this was slightly before the Ukraine invasion, and in the third season of the show, Russia is trying to stage a major operation in, I think it was the Baltics, Latvia or Estonia. I think it was Estonia, and so the CIA has to really pull out all the stops to get ahead of things and stop the Russians from doing this. So this was it does get way more positive towards the CIA in the second and third season.
For the left that's taken over the CIA is more positive for them. It's anti-Trump. Yeah. It's more woke. It's more anti-MAGA. Whatever. We don't want to make the CIA doesn't want to make America great again. That's evil.
What do you think of Deutschland? What do you think of Deutschland 83?
I've only seen the first episode or two, and it's more realistically done. Let me put it that way. And of course, it is, very German. It's made by Germans. It's in German, and it's almost a comical depiction of the way people were in 1983. Both this young East German who gets recruited to impersonate a West German officer. He really is a kind of naive boy.
Yeah.
Who's naively loyal because that's all he knows to the East German communist system, and he goes into the West, and it's very interesting. And the general he ends up working for is really comical, because even when this boy is accused, and he doesn't believe the accuser is this crazy lady that doesn't know, it's I think it's his is it his wife's sister, and so it's just, and he just really he takes to this young boy because he has these Boy Scout, these very naive characteristics that are likable.
And the general, have you seen the general's son yet? Because he turns into a communist activist, and he's a real piece of work. So at some point
the spoiled West German kids. It's much more sophisticated than Berlin Station is like an American drama with all of the sophisticated presentation to drag you in, and the left-wing themes tucked in between. But Deutschland 83 it's much more sophisticated, realistic drama. It's pretty good. Of course,
it's a rare bit of anti-communism in this modern era. This was really unusual when I watched it. I thought, as the show progresses, there's really nothing positive about the East German espionage.
Yeah, beautiful irony and sarcasm, and in this piece. So I thank you for that. That's a very good piece of drama, and I bought them at. You can get these dramas at Amazon Video. You can buy them, or I guess rent them. I don't know what the options are, but I like to have them because if they're good, I want to show them to friends and see them more than once.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's this character in the show. He's a university professor that's his cover. He's really a communist Stasi agent, and he's so
Yeah,
callous and
he's
such
directing
a
this kid in his
slime
spy
ball.
mission. Yeah,
He's the
he
handler. He's
is a
such a
slime ball.
slime ball, and he's running. He's gay, and he's sleeping with his students, and he's
Oh, I
recruiting
haven't
them. And
seen that part yet.
yeah, he's sleeping with his students, and he's recruiting them, and
Oh,
he's directing the activism against the American involvement and all of it. And he's such a piece of work. I mean, you just want to see this guy,
wow.
just get it. And yeah, that
Well,
was
is Germany? Can Germany ever get back to making those kind of movies? I mean,
sure. I
well, the
mean,
lives of others tells the truth
no,
too
there's actually
about Germany.
it's actually it seems to be coming back now. There was also
Hmm.
a movie done. It's well, the title you would translate it just to balloon, right? This was done by this was directed by an actor who was known for silly comedies. Nobody expected anything serious from him, and so
Seriously,
so he
yeah,
makes this film, and it's called Balloon here, and it's was one of the most terrifying movies I ever saw. I mean, it's not a
really.
horror movie. It's not a horror movie, but it's so intense, and you feel for the characters, and it's. I mean, I was on the edge of my seat the whole time because it's about this family in communist Germany, and they want to escape. They just want to escape, which is of course completely illegal. And so they get this
Right.
idea. They fabricate their own hot air balloon because they know how to make it, and so they have the equipment, and so they source the materials, and they try to operate this balloon. Escape with the whole family, but something goes wrong, and so
Well, of
the
course, the prevailing winds will blow them into the Soviet Union.
no, but it's some
Go for it.
technical issue, and they crash land, and they have to get into the car again and drive home, but the Stasi finds that balloon, and they start investigating, and so they have a few clues, a few leads, and it's a race against time. So this really nice family, two kids, I believe. This family, they have to make a second balloon, and this time it has to work because time is against them, because the Stasi is hunting them. They're getting closer and closer to them, and so it's this nerve-wracking race to make this stupid balloon and make this short journey over the border. And so the threat, of course, is that the parents would get imprisoned for a long time, and the kids would end up in one of these horrific children's asylums, or what they call them. These were some of the worst places on earth. I mean, so many scandals came out about that. If your children ended up in these places, I mean, this is a nightmare. And so
Mhm.
I was terrified the whole time because there were stories like this. I think this is even based on a true story. So you're just on the edge of your seat. You want this family to succeed, and you have these suave actors playing these Stasi agents, and it's just the whole situation is utterly terrifying. And this was
Wow.
a great movie, and this was a serious piece of anti-communism. And I thought, wow, this is really coming back now. Well, this was
Well,
great.
that's good to hear. Well, maybe people will turn the right corner. Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you, folks, for listening. I'm Jeff Nquist in America. That was Alex Benesch in Germany, and hope you will join us again next week for another edition.